So let's begin with the definition of our method of analysis, because we have a long analysis ahead of us. Let us begin. As you know, people, if you come over here over at Twitch, if you drop by the Twitch stream, you will realize in my panels I have a lot of explanations about how my analyses are metaphysically realist analysis, basically involving philosophical realism, which is the opposite of relativism, and basically the main premise of a philosophically realist analysis is that when we define metaphysical reality, when we define existence, we don't define it as it is usually unconsciously defined by relativist game reviewers. Generally people, I'll try to do this as brief as possible, when you define reality as the sum of our mental perceptions, opinions, or doxas, as we used to call them in ancient Greece, when you unconsciously define metaphysical reality and metaphysical entities in it as the sum of our mental perceptions, of our opinions, simply the sum of those opinions define reality. That's usually how relativism works. It's a matter of mental perception. It's a matter of opinion. It's something that must have happened to you. It's to you all watching this as a YouTube pod. Pretty much when you have a discussion with someone, it doesn't need to be a violent discussion or anything like that. An intellectual debate, any intellectual debate you could possibly think of, and the person is cornered, the person doesn't have any more logical arguments, generally the person will say, alright, but that's your opinion and this is mine and that's it. That is exactly what we are not going to do here, because that's relativism and because that makes it impossible to transcend our mental perception and define metaphysical reality. Right? It's a matter of two mental perceptions. Relativism generally works like this. Two mental perceptions. You have your opinion, I have mine. But objective conclusions are never reached as a direct consequence of that mindset. That's precisely what we are not going to do. What we are going to do is to use philosophical realism. Why? Because, as I always mention in my analysis, while relativism works at ruling a country, at for example, creating laws or organizing a society in general, we all vote. Think about your own Congress or Parliament. In the case it's a European country, Congress in the case of us, North American and South American countries. And as I always mention, think about those. Think about your own Congress or Parliament. The congressmen basically raise their hands and they vote, and the majority of mental perceptions, of opinions, of doxas, as we used to call them in ancient Greece, rules. We vote and majority rules. That is completely untenable and inefficient, absolutely useless at analyzing isolated objects, because it is impossible to reach metaphysical reality through the simple sum of opinions as your definition of reality. Because a person will have a mental perception, I will have another mental perception, and that's it. We never reach an objective conclusion. This is precisely what we are going to do here on the channel. As I've said, discarding relativism, we'll use philosophical realism. What's the point then? What's the point? Precisely. Since metaphysical reality isn't the sum of our mental perceptions, but an external entity, an external metaphysical entity, when compared to our opinions, to our mental perception, we will use it because it's more effective at analyzing isolated objects. The example that I always use, and please, well, I gave you a disclaimer for followers of the Twitch channel, and over at Discord they must be fed up of listening to me comment this constantly, pretty much. As I always mention, people, as I always mention, when we do this comparison between two mental perceptions, there will always be one out of two opinions. There will always be one that is closer in its description, in its accuracy of its description of metaphysical reality. The description of metaphysical reality will be more accurate out of two mental perceptions, out of two opinions. Of course, we cannot rule a society or organize it with that, but when it comes to analyzing isolated objects, it's more effective, as I constantly say on stream. Right, people. So I have already given you the theory, the methodology of the theory, the theory of the methodology, sorry, that we are going to employ when analyzing games. But I'll give you also a down-to-earth example that I always do on stream. That's why I say Discord members and followers of the channel, old followers of the channel, they already know about this. But for those of you watching this as a YouTube VOD, pretty much, so I leave it attached to the analysis. Let's get to a down-to-earth example. People, this is a gaming mouse, right? It's a gaming mouse. But what if I asked you, what if I posed the question, why is it a gaming mouse? Is it a gaming mouse? Why is it that your mind defines it as a gaming mouse? Why? Why is it a gaming mouse? The logical answer that most of you would logically tell me, it's absolutely natural, it would be to tell me that this is a gaming mouse, that we refer to it as a gaming mouse, that we call this a gaming mouse, because we have all agreed to call it like that. There you can see the perfect fallacy and inefficiency of relativism at analyzing isolated objects, right? Because if I say that it is correct to call it a gaming mouse, because we have all agreed collectively, the sum of our mental perceptions have agreed to call it like that, and its metaphysical entity has to be referred to as a gaming mouse because we decided collectively to call it like that, there isn't any logical background behind it. It's just the sum of our mental perceptions. Let's get to the realist analysis. This, and you will see the perfect difference if you're watching this as a YouTube VOD, but you'll appreciate it. This is a gaming mouse, because it's the methodology of our analysis. This is a gaming mouse, not because of our sum of mental perceptions. It is a gaming mouse because it's a specific combination of molecules and particles that is so specific, so precisely specific, that could never be, for example, a chair. So, out of two mental perceptions, calling this a chair or calling this a gaming mouse, out of two mental perceptions, there will always be one that is closer in its description to metaphysical reality. Even by 0.0000001%, even by 1%, even by a slight detail, it is objectively more accurate to call this a gaming mouse and not a chair. Why? Because it's a specific combination of molecules and particles that simply is completely different when compared to a chair. The description of calling this a gaming mouse is objective. The existence of this metaphysical entity, it's external when compared to my mental perception. It doesn't matter if my mind decides to call this a chair. It is still a gaming mouse. Even if we all agree to call it a chair, and humanity has been brainwashed to call this a chair for whatever reason, it will still be metaphysically a gaming mouse. Because its metaphysical entity and essence, they are both external when compared to my mind. We can use even a closer example, and I'll prove it to you. Between calling this, we'll use an even more subtle example that I always use. Between calling this a gaming mouse and calling this an electronic device, they are pretty close. It is still more objectively accurate. My mental perception is closer in its description to metaphysical reality, to describing metaphysical reality, if I call this a gaming mouse instead of an electronic device. Why? Even by 1%, even if it is also an electronic device, calling this a gaming mouse also incorporates the idea of shape. This object, this metaphysical entity, it's a specific combination of molecules and particles which has the shape of an animal with which the human race has been in contact with for millions and millions of years, and subconsciously our brain associates the abstract concept of gaming mouse with the shape of an animal that we have been in contact with for millions of years. It has the very same shape, this metaphysical entity. So it is more objectively accurate to describe this as a gaming mouse when compared to describing this as an electronic device. See, even by 1%, even by 0.001% out of two mental perceptions, calling this an electronic device or calling this a gaming mouse, out of those two mental perceptions, it is much more accurate to describe this as a gaming mouse. So it is objectively, it's not a matter of my mental perception, it is more objectively accurate to describe it like that. There's a more objective mental perception out of the two of them, out of three, out of four, out of all of the mental perceptions that humanity is constantly having for every millisecond, constantly, even right now, all human beings. That is the methodology that we are going to apply to our game, that we apply to our game reviews here on the channel and for the final analysis of Sacred 2. We will try through our mental perception, through our reverse engineering of my mental perception in this case, to try to reach metaphysical reality in our description of the game. Direct consequence that philosophical realism has in games is that and it must have happened to people, is that most game reviewers, most professional gaming press will tell you that the fact that you like or dislike a game, it's a matter of mere subjective mental perception. The second you do that, the second I tell you that a game is good or bad, according to your own opinion, according to your own mental perception, and this is the very reason why relativism is ineffective at analyzing isolated objects like movies, books, video games, or a very gaming mouse, or a simple gaming mouse. It's because relativism changes the focus of the analysis from the object, in this case the video game, to the subject. It changes the focus of the analysis from the object to the subject. In the case of the chair and the gaming mouse, you can call this a chair or a gaming mouse according to your mental perception, without any logical reasons. So, pretty much, in the case of video games, the game will be good or bad depending on my own opinion, on my own mental perception of metaphysical reality. There's no dissociation between metaphysical reality and my mental perception, and the sum of our opinions defines metaphysical reality. And as I've said, that's completely untenable and useless at analyzing isolated objects. It works for organizing a society, it doesn't work for analyzing isolated objects. Or, in this case, it doesn't matter if the object it's material, it's composed of matter, or if it's composed of bits in a screen and it's more abstract. Doesn't matter, it's the same concept. So the direct consequence of doing a relativist gaming review is that the quality of a game will be completely subjective according to personal taste. That is precisely what we are going to completely discard and eliminate out of our analysis that we are going to do today. But just so you know the methodology, we will base our analysis on I base all of my analysis on a 5 pronged system that you'll see for the duration of this long review that we are going to do, that will try to reverse engineer my mental perception of the game to reach metaphysical reality, a common ground between all of your mental perceptions of the game and my mental perception of the game, so we can all together reach metaphysical, objective metaphysical reality. Perfect. So, the quality of a game, as a conclusion, isn't a matter of personal taste. For example, it's a matter of how do you describe metaphysical reality. It's an objective matter. It is true that one can have preferences, that one can like one genre more than the other one, but for example, I would never say that, I don't know, a game that I liked a lot, subjectively, my mental perception, is the best game of all time. For example, imagine if someone only played Fortnite for 15 or 20 years, which is the case for a lot of people, and they say it's the best game of all time. And most people will have the reaction, when confronted with that claim, that it is wrong. But most people won't be able to tell that person why it is objectively wrong. It's not a matter of our mental perception of it, because we know that the level design complexity, the gameplay mechanic, the abstract model of the gameplay mechanics and their complexity, a lot of things that you'll see once we get to the analysis of Sacred 2, the graphics quality, everything, objectively, in a comparison with other games, Fortnite is simply not the best game of all time. It is objectively wrong to say that, for example. Even if it's your favorite game, that's perfectly acceptable. It's your mental perception. But when trying to reach the common ground of metaphysical reality and describing the metaphysical entity of Fortnite as the best game of all time, it is objectively wrong. See that I can do a dissociation between my mental perception, or in this case the mental perception of that individual. My favorite game of all time is Star Wars: The Republic, and I know that there are cases that, for example, Baldur's Gate influenced much more the classic RPG genre, just as a random example. And like that is the same. In the mind of this person who thinks that Fortnite is the best game of all time, subjectively, it doesn't change the fact that objectively, that it is metaphysically objective to consider other games as the best games of all time. Pretty much. So, as a direct consequence, we're not going to do a subjective analysis. I won't tell you that, for example, you will like Sacred 2 as a direct consequence. If you like Diablo 2, you will like Sacred 2, because I'm not giving you a logical reason behind it, which is what most reviewers usually say. Most reviewers usually say if a game is addictive, it's good. If it's not addictive, it's not good. And that's because they are unable to reverse engineer the logical process behind reaching metaphysical reality. They are stuck in their own mental perception. So it is actually addictive. Then the immediate question we should pose is, why is it addictive? Generally because there's a psychological sense of progression which creates that feeling of addictiveness in the brain, in the brain of the player, due to a psychological sense of progression that the game is able to create on the player. Good people, I think that's enough. We have a long analysis ahead of us, so without further ado, you already have the methodology that we are going to use. Everything perfectly explained in a very brief way in 20 minutes. It's a very complex topic to talk about in 20 minutes. If you like the topic, I highly recommend you drop by the stream and we talk about it as we usually do if you are watching this as a YouTube pod in the future. It falls in a pretty unique category, which is the category of the offline MMORPG, in this case with an isometric camera, but it falls in a very specific category that doesn't have a lot of examples to cite. For example, Mythos would be an example. It was an online an MMORPG, but it was re-released offline. So Sacred 2 is a pretty similar case. It's quite unusual. So if you like, the first thing that I can tell you is that if you are having issues finding offline MMORPGs, Sacred 2 is probably your best bet, one of the best examples, one of the epitomes of this development philosophy that you will find. So, heading into that second conclusion a bit more, the genre classification. Sacred 2 is an offline MMORPG. And why am I highlighting the genre classification of Sacred 2 as part of the intro? Well, basically, due to the fact that I've seen that this game is classified as a Diablo clone a lot nowadays, and that it's a grave, terrible mistake. Why? Because it has a lot of elements that, while the game does inherit isolated elements from the isometric action RPG genre, from the MMORPG genre, from the classic RPG genre. Just in case you have a quick reference, when I say isometric action RPG genre, I'm referring to Diablo clones. The technical correct denomination is isometric action RPG. MMORPG, we all know. You'll see that I always cite World of Warcraft as a quick reference because it's kind of like the common ground that we have all mostly played. It's the most popular MMORPG. And then classic RPG, Baldur's Gate. Otherwise, I would cite Star Wars: The Republic, which is my favorite MMO of all time. But just as a common ground reference, I will always cite as MMORPG comparison World of Warcraft because it's the most popular. So we can all have a common ground of analysis. Perfect. While Sacred 2 draws elements, it inherits DNA from all of those genres, the predominant influence is that of the MMORPG genre. It's much more similar to World of Warcraft than an isometric action RPG like Diablo 2, like Titan Quest, like Torchlight, etc., etc., etc. The Incredible Adventures of Van Helsing, etc., etc. It's much more similar to World of Warcraft. Why? First logical reason of the analysis. Why? In terms of the genre classification, we can cite the quest density, first of all, in terms of the level design. We'll get to the level design in depth later, but as a part of the genre classification intro of the analysis, the quest density of this game is that of an MMORPG. It's not similar to the one that you'll find in Diablo. In Diablo 2, just as a quick reference, in Diablo 3, I won't count the quests, but they are not even close to the amount of quests that I'm about to refer to here when I begin with Sacred 2. In Sacred 2, in the case of Diablo 2, it was 6 quests per chapter, and we had 4 chapters, 24 plus the expansion. Pretty much when we make this comparison, people, think about those, think about Diablo 2's quests, and now I will describe you what Sacred 2 does. Sacred 2 has 600 quests. That's 3 times the amount of quests, 3 times the amount of quests that you will find in Borderlands 1, for example, because if I'm not mistaken, I'm just using my memory here, Borderlands 1 had 214 or 16 total quests, doing everything, getting up to Cromorax the Invincible. You'll see that I'll also cite Borderlands a lot in the gameplay category of the analysis because of the elemental system of the game. But let's compare that. So the quest density of this game is 3 times, we're talking about 600 quests unmodded, and 700 quests if you mod the game, because different classes can pick different quests. So we are talking about 600 to 700, according if it's modded, if it's modded 700, if it's unmodded 600. We are talking about 3 or more times the amount of quests in Borderlands. So the level design, my first argument to classify this game as an MMORPG, as an offline isometric MMORPG instead of an isometric action RPG, is the quest density. It has the quest density of an MMORPG. Second argument, the extension of the terrain, the extension of the overworld, and the massive underground network, the world of this game, which we'll talk in depth when we get to the level design, but just so you have a reference, the directly linked to the genre classification as to why this is an offline isometric MMORPG. it has the extension of the terrain of an MMORPG, not of what we usually call a Diablo clone, of an isometric action RPG, or like Titan Quest, or like Shadows Awakening, Torchlight, etc. It's not linear, so the philosophy behind that level design is also that of an MMORPG. And third, and this will be another element that we'll talk about not in the level design but in the gameplay, is that the cooldown times and the overall development philosophy behind the ability cooldowns of this game and the pacing is that of an MMORPG. Abilities have long cooldowns. You can manipulate that stat, as we'll get into that soon, so I won't comment about that until we get into the gameplay category. But basically, the pacing of the combat is that of an MMORPG. It doesn't have the hack and slash component that you might find in Diablo 3 or Diablo 2. The combat it's a bit slower because it adds casting time. It adds the concept of pushback, which is usually an intrinsic part of MMORPGs, but is not found in isometric action RPG games, for example. And I would say that due to those three elements, quest density, extension of the terrain, and the development philosophy behind the pacing of the pacing and the cooldown of the cooldown of abilities and the pacing of combat overall, due to those three elements, I would classify this game as an offline, isometric because of the camera, MMORPG. I know that this category is pretty weird for a lot of you. I know it's pretty weird because it's unusual if you haven't been in contact with these games, but there are some examples like Mythos, like for example, well, it's not offline. Mythos is now offline. For example, Hellgate London would fall in this category as well. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, it was originally an MMORPG, so it could fall under this category. Xenoblade Chronicles, or at least the first one. Dragon's Dogma, it's pretty similar, but it incorporates Monster Hunter elements. It's that weird category in which you have an offline MMORPG, in this case with an isometric camera. Getting to a more direct comparison with more popular games, just to establish objective comparisons, precisely, talking about metaphysical realism. Lineage 2, it's an MMORPG. This one is online. Sacred 2 could also be played online back in the day, and it is still playable online, I believe, thanks to the community. So Lineage 2, it has isometric camera, and it's an MMORPG due to the pacing of the combat when compared to the hack and slash nature of Diablo 3. Another example would be Ark. I don't know if you played it. Ark, it's a Korean modern isometric MMORPG. I wouldn't classify it as an isometric action RPG like Diablo, because it introduces the idea, the abstract concept of group-oriented content, something that Sacred 2 definitely blurred the line between MMORPG and isometric action RPG. As I've said, it takes from all genres, but it is true that the most predominant one is MMORPG. So, we've already done the genre classification. Oh, the gameplay category of the analysis. The main reason why this game is such an amazing gem, and this is pretty much a spoiler, but well, you can see that I love the game while playing it, as I progressively analyzed it. The first category of the analysis, the gameplay, we begin with an element that is pretty much the essence of any RPG. We'll begin with the combat, and throughout my 40 days of analysis, of continuous analysis of the game, I can pretty much tell you that this game's combat, following the genre classification that we did of being an isometric offline MMORPG, an offline isometric MMORPG, pretty much, it's absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing. If we take into account the abstract complexity alone, which is the very main factor, because of which I would say that this is one of the greatest games of all time, and I've analyzed a lot. is the abstract complexity precisely of the gameplay mechanics. Let's begin with the basics. Let's begin with the basics and establishing comparisons. What's the usual case in most isometric action RPG games, MMORPG games, classic RPG games, and modern RPG games? Generally, you have one type of damage. You use your combat abilities, like in World of Warcraft or like in Diablo. One type of damage, enemies take that damage, and it's all one-dimensional. This is the huge difference between the first evident difference in terms of the abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics that I've been mentioning in Sacred 2. Sacred 2, if we had to establish a rank, here we have at the bottom of the rank games with a one-dimensional type of damage, World of Warcraft, Diablo, pretty much 99% of RPGs in general, regardless of the sub-classification. Pretty much you deal one type of damage and that's it. And that's pretty much it, and you have armor or something to defend yourself. Pretty much. Sacred 2 has 5 types of elemental damage. It has 5 types of elemental damage. So right off the bat, you get 5 types of elemental damage. Physical, magic, poison, fire, and ice. This brings a lot of abstract complexity to the gameplay mechanics because the player has to worry about 5 different types of damage, and basically you have to search for loot. The player has to search for loot, and the player has to search for different gameplay options that we'll get into in detail that will eventually allow him to master those 5 types of elemental damages. As a direct contrast, enemies will have those 5 types of elemental damages. Some will have ice, some will have poison, some will have magic, and they will have those 5 types of elemental resistances. Some will have physical, some will have others. As a general common denominator, there's one detail that I don't want to forget about. Both the player and NPCs and enemies will always have, by default, physical resistance, which is pretty much the first element that you learn to master when you start playing the game as part of the early game gameplay mechanics. So we have 5 types of elemental damage. Just because of that, the abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics, of the mental model of the game, it's absolutely higher when compared to World of Warcraft or Diablo, because it's multi-dimensional. So if we have to establish a more direct comparison, we could use Borderlands, which it's not an MMORPG, it's an FPS RPG in that case, but it has the development philosophy of an MMORPG, Borderlands, the first one, and the second one as well. But pretty much, people, World of Warcraft, Diablo, and a lot of modern RPGs, they are one-dimensional because they only have one type of damage. It's plain and much more brain-dead and simple in a direct comparison with Sacred 2, because you have to worry about 5 types of elemental damages that are effective or not, pretty similar to Pokemon as well. You have to worry about to be effective in combat. So as a direct comparison, we can use Borderlands. Borderlands has elemental damages, poison, fire, no, it was acid, it was called acid, fire, electric damage, pretty much the same system. The predecessor of Borderlands, which is Hellgate London, also uses this system. Now, we've already established that the elemental system of Sacred 2 is objectively superior when compared to one-dimensional systems like World of Warcraft. Good. Direct comparison with Borderlands then. Borderlands does have an elemental system, designed for it, right? It's implemented within the gameplay mechanics. But there's a detail. The same with Hellgate London. It is only used offensively. I'll repeat it. The elemental system used in Borderlands, it's only used offensively. In Sacred 2, the elemental system, it's used defensively as well. So, let's get to down-to-earth examples. In Borderlands, you just have to worry about the elemental damage that your weapon deals, pretty similar to Hellgate London. You loot your weapon, you have electric damage. If you loot the correct weapon, you have electric damage, you have acid damage, you have fire damage. Good. In Sacred 2, in a pretty similar way, you loot weapons that will define at least your basic attack. This is the second layer of complexity, of abstract complexity, that we'll go back to. But just so you have a reference, you loot weapons that will determine your elemental damage type of your basic attacks, like fire, like magic, etc. It took me 30 days up until mid-game, close to end-game gameplay, mid-game gameplay, to loot the correct weapon that will allow me to modify my elemental damage. So, up until that moment, it's the same in Borderlands and in Sacred 2. However, there's a divergence. Because in Borderlands, what's the defensive system in Borderlands, people? You loot a shield, and enemies all deal fire damage, etc. But it's all mitigated by the same shield and your health, pretty much, and your health bar. And it's pretty much the same. Defensively, Borderlands, it's one-dimensional as well. Just like World of Warcraft and the classic Blizzard system is one-dimensional, and most modern RPG games are one-dimensional in terms of the offensive system, in the sense that weapons deal the same type of damage. Borderlands, it's defensively one-dimensional. Only a shield, you don't loot pieces of gear at all, and if you think about World of Warcraft, that you do loot pieces of gear, the elemental system is not implemented because it doesn't exist. It's always the same type of damage caused by mobs, and the same type of damage caused by the player to the mobs. So it's one-dimensional. So Sacred 2, and this is the first crowning achievement of this game, why I'm referring to it as one of the best games of all time, because if we are establishing this ranking, then we have World of Warcraft and the classic Diablo system in terms of the abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics. Games one-dimensional combat systems without elemental damages at the bottom. The player only has to worry about one type of damage. Second layer of complexity, a step above it, would be Borderlands, due to the fact that Borderlands forces a player to care about four types of elemental damage. But this is only done offensively. In Borderlands, the player only has to worry about those four types of damage offensively. In the case of Sacred 2, if we had to place it, it would be right here at the top, at the very top of that ranking. Why? Because it does have a multi-dimensional elemental system implemented in its gameplay mechanics that it's used both offensively and defensively. This is objective, and that objectively makes the combat system superior, because there's more variety. Because the abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics is higher. The abstract complexity is higher. The mental model required in the player's mind to master the gameplay mechanics in Sacred 2, it's much higher. And as I always say, complexity enhances replayability, and the second replayability is enhanced, the game lasts for much more time, and as I always say, the human brain works through repetition. People, think about the game that you remember the most when you think about gaming, and it will probably be a long game like World of Warcraft, like Diablo, like the longest games ever. Why? Because the brain works through repetition. The games that you'll remember the most are those which create that psychological sense of progression on the player, which generates that addiction. Pretty much, this psychological effect, that the creation of this psychological sense of progression on the player is directly linked to the duration of the game with a high abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics. And Sacred 2 understands that. In fact, I would venture out to say that the developers over at Ascaron were masters of the genre that perfectly understood the psychology behind any player that played their game ever, and that takes a high level of mastery that we rarely see. So we can safely say that just because of that, the developers over at Ascaron were masters of the genre. Well, going back to our ranking, Sacred 2 implements an elemental system defensively. How does it do it? Through the relic system of the game. Besides looting your weapons, your headgear, your armor, your boots, your shoes, whatever, besides looting all of the pieces of your normal gear, Sacred 2 has other items which are called relics. They are small round circles which you can equip 3 of them per elemental resistance. Of the game. As I've said, except for physical resistance, because that one is handled universally through your own gear. Your gear, your normal equipment, provides you physical armor. And the other 4 types of elemental resistances, which will mitigate the elemental damage caused by mobs, are 3 fire relics. You have 4 sets of 3 fire relics, of 3 relics per elemental resistance. Basically, you'll have at the end of the day 3 fire relics, 3 ice relics, 3 magic relics, and 3 poison relics, with different degrees of quality, following the classic Blizzard classification of loot, of being common quality white, magic quality blue, and pretty much yellow quality and exceptional, and pretty much orange quality, dark orange, legendary, just like in Borderlands, following the classic Blizzard classification of loot. Good. So the relic system, it's not only that the elemental system of the game is used both offensively through player attacks and defensively through the relics and the gear of the player. It's not just that. There's an extra component of abstract complexity. There are 2 more actually, but the first one is regarding the defensive aspect of the game. The other one is regarding the offensive aspect that you'll see in a moment. The player when the player is attacked, when he's attacked, the player has the option of dynamically change the set of relics that he's using. Pretty much that has a lot of consequences. The first one being that the player has to take an active role in terms of the defensive system implemented in the elemental system of the gameplay mechanics. The player has to actively change the elemental resistance as he is fighting. Compare that to Borderlands, which is just a shield, in which the player doesn't need to do anything at all to defend from attacks. If in the case of Sacred 2, the player is naturally, organically encouraged to master elemental resistances actively. The player has to change from fire resistance to ice resistance to poison resistance and magic resistance constantly according to the elemental damage type of the mob. As I said, mobs do have the very same elemental damage and defenses that the player has. So that's another thing, the fact that this game establishes a direct one-to-one a direct one-to-one association between the rules implemented on mobs in terms of the elemental system that they use for both attack and defense, and it has a direct correlation because it's the same system as the one implemented for the player. There are other games that have that in which elemental systems are dissociated. The player has a set of rules and mobs have a different set of rules. In the case of Sacred 2, there's an absolute correlation between the elemental system forced on the player and the one implemented forced on the mobs. Pretty much is the same. That allows a correlation, a direct comparison that creates a much more complex system. Because think about it, people. What is it more? What's harder? Give the player a set of rules and then create the world to adapt to those rules and like that manage the difficulty curve, or create a common system between mob and player in which they both have the same rules. Baldur's Gate does this, for example. They have the same rules, and the player shares that set of rules and limitations with the mobs. It's much more difficult to measure game balance and the overall difficulty curve of the game when there's a shared correlated system between mobs and players. Good. Let's get to the other aspects. So, Sacred 2 is so far the only game that implements an active and defensive elemental system in the gameplay mechanics so far that I've seen. As I've said, Borderlands implements a multidimensional elemental system, but it's not used defensively, it's only used offensively, and most modern RPGs are one-dimensional. They only have one type of damage, and it's the same. There are no resistances involved or anything at all. You might see elemental resistances, but as a general stat, not kind of like broken down in the different 5 types that I'm mentioning, for example. Then let's get to the other element of the abstract complexity of the elemental system of Sacred 2 in terms of the gameplay mechanics. When the player can perform 2 types of attacks. Let's get to the offensive system of the game. Basic attacks or abilities, pretty similar to MMORPGs, though in MMORPGs there's a predominance of the usage of abilities instead of basic attacks. In that sense, we can see an inherited influence of the isometric action RPG genre, which does not change the genre classification due to the 3 reasons that I gave you in the intro of the analysis. So basically, the magic of Sacred 2 is not only the fact that it uses the elemental system defensively, but also that it adds a second layer of complexity to the offensive system of the game. As I've said, you can perform basic attacks and you can perform abilities. However, the elemental types of the basic attacks, when compared to the elemental types of the abilities, are dissociated in their respective loot systems. A quite interesting concept, people, that I have never seen in any other video game. That's why this game is so unique. Pretty much, the elemental type, you start out with only physical damage and you have to incorporate the other 4. Through your weapons, there's an insane amount of weapon types in the game, but they all respond to this classification of 5 elemental damage types that I've said: physical, magic, poison, fire, and ice. That elemental system, in terms of the basic attacks, it has a dissociated loot system. Your weapons, or your weapon if you're using a 2-handed weapon, will determine the elemental damage type of your basic attack, right? In my case, I was using dual staves, pretty similar to Gandalf. I was using dual staves, and each of them, the 2 of them, had roughly 30% physical damage, 30% fire damage, 30% magical damage. So I had 3 types of damage. In terms of my basic attacks would always be like that, with those 3 elemental damage types. However, when casting an ability, my elemental damage type, if you have watched my gameplay, was first ice. According to each ability, inherently has its own elemental damage type, which is different when compared to the basic attack. For example, Dislodged Spirit, which was an ability that I used a lot, it was 100% ice damage. And when I looted a pair of globes, a piece of equipment at the end of the day, it had a specific stat that said converts damage to poison, ability damage to poison. I bet you can see the difference now. The dissociation, the magnificence, it's absolutely fascinating that this dissociation between the elemental damage type of basic attacks and the elemental damage type of abilities, that they are handled separately. This dissociation creates a bidimensional system in terms of the offensive elemental system of the game that I have been mentioning. It's a second layer of abstract complexity on top of the offensive elemental system of the game, like in Borderlands, which is also used defensively, which is another layer of complexity. As you can see, the elemental system of this game broke through the limit of Borderlands, having been developed before it. So through those globes that I was mentioning, my Dislodged Spirit ability, which would originally deal ice damage, after I looted those globes and started using them, it would deal poison damage. So my globes affected my combat abilities, and my weapons affected my basic attacks, the elemental damage type of each of those. So that dissociation adds an extra layer of abstract complexity that I have never seen. So absolute kudos to the developers, and you can see why I'm giving you logical reasons, objective logical reasons as to why this is one of the best games of all time. As I was mentioning, people, as I was precisely mentioning. So we have the elemental system with those 2 extra layers of complexity on top of it. If we had to establish a ranking, Sacred 2 is at the very top. It's one of the most complex elemental systems of all time. So, and if you think about it, and I mentioned this in one of the last streams, think about most modern games, how they are handled. They usually don't have an elemental system in place with different types of damages and resistances. And second, if you think about it, a player, what are the actions that the player performs? Attacks. The player performs attacks and receives the damage of mobs' attacks. Pretty much attack and defense. If you think about it, defense, it's 50% of the gameplay mechanics of the player in the whole system of a video game, especially of an RPG generally. It's 50%. Most modern games they discard 50% of the potential of the gameplay mechanics if we analyze them in comparison to Sacred 2. So Sacred 2 has that invisible 50% of the gameplay mechanics that you won't see in a lot of other modern RPG games. Only because of that, the gameplay mechanics are objectively superior to 99% of the games that you'll stumble upon nowadays. Only because of that single fact. Because 50% of the gameplay mechanics, attack and defense is absolutely omitted nowadays. In a lot of cases. Not all of them, but in a lot of cases. Because the player doesn't have to worry about defense. For example, Borderlands. 50% of the gameplay mechanics are discarded. If you put that into perspective, the end result is that this game deserved an absolute... it deserved to be a legend at this point. It deserved to be as popular as World of Warcraft or something like that. Because of the added extra abstract complexity, it's absolutely amazing. Well, the elemental system. First element of the gameplay mechanics. It's already been an hour. You can see that. We'll dissect the game slowly but surely. That's what we do here on the channel with our system. The abstract complexity of the elemental system. pretty much the crowning achievement of the game, the first element of the gameplay mechanics. Let's get to the second element of the gameplay of the game. Enemy variety, mechanics, everything that has to do with combat that doesn't have to do with the attacks and the defense of the player. Enemy mob mechanics. Pretty much the enemy variety in this game far exceeds everything you could possibly think of. If I had to establish a reference, Titan Quest has probably the most amazing enemy variety in isometric action RPG games, and the same goes for World of Warcraft. Pretty much assigning a type of enemy for each area. This game follows that line of reasoning. For example, pretty much you'll fight kobolds in the first area as a general idea, but there are many more variations, from goblins to bandits to pirates, to with all of them perfectly affected by the elemental system that I'm mentioning. Here we can see the first relationship of many that we're going to cover here today, which is the fact that the elemental damage types and elemental defenses are directly linked to the type of enemy, so different enemies will have different types of elemental resistances and damages. So the incredible enemy variety of the game, which is amazing. You can fight scorpions, all types of mythological creatures, griffins. It would be a lot of dragons. Everything you could possibly think of. Trolls, orcs, the typical ones that we use, but they even added a lot of extra imagination to it. There are a lot of enemy designs that we usually don't stumble upon in terms of video games, which are kind of like there are a lot of ghosts, for example. A lot. The enemy variety is top notch, and the interesting part is that it is exponentially much more rich than your common enemy variety because of the influence of the elemental system on enemy variety. So generally, I think Hellgate London does this. Generally, and Borderlands does this. It's incredible how Borderlands and Hellgate London implement an elemental resistances defensive system for enemies, but not for the player. It's the very same case here. Different enemies will have different types of resistances and different types of damages. But specifically in this case, in the case of resistances, that the player will need to find those. They are displayed for the player in a health bar at the bottom of the screen when the player targets the mob. Pretty much those exponentially enhance. See how we can see the first relationship? Those exponentially enhance the elemental system of the game. Good. So amazing enemy variety, the best you'll probably ever find in your life. Absolutely massive and incredible. So perfect. As well as the objective variety, but that's part of the level design. Let's get to the next topic. Let's get to the very few flaws that I've encountered in terms of the gameplay. I mentioned this as the third element. Let's get to the third element, which will also be roughly short. Then we'll get into the stat system, which is a bit longer, and the skill tree. But just so you have a reference, in terms of the flaws of the games of the game related to the gameplay, I would say that the targeting system could have been much more precise. Why? Because generally, on average, it is precise. You have to hover over enemies and cast your abilities or attack them simply by clicking the mouse or double tapping your keys on your keyboard. Pretty much. However, for some reason, the game does not allow you to target the ground. It does not allow you to target the ground when casting area of effect abilities. For example, my Levin array, my Force Lightning as I like to call it, I have to hover over the enemy to cast it, and that hovered enemy will be the epicenter of the ability, of the area of effect ability. It doesn't allow the player to target the ground, and I think that's a targeting flaw. Just to establish a reference, as I always mention, back during the 5th generation, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time fixed the problem of targeting in a three-dimensional game thanks to the C index, in which you press a button and the camera focuses around that enemy. Pretty much, that's the inherited system by Dark Souls. I'm just using my memory here, people. There are many more games like that. That's one solution. The other solution, and the case of games with an isometric camera, for example, World of Warcraft, while it doesn't make the camera go around the target, it allows, through the press of a button, to focus on that target, to focus on that target. Here, there's no focusing. In Sacred 2, there's no focusing, pretty similar to Diablo 2, and here's the huge influence of the isometric action RPG genre on it, which I think is less important than the genre-defining quest density or the pretty much the structure of the level design. Alright, as I've said, targeting could have been it's not as accurate as a perfectly accurate game. Pretty much it could have been much more accurate, because as I said, you cannot target the ground for area of effect abilities. You have no ground reference of where your ability will land. Instead, you hover over the enemy and it will be the epicenter of your area of effect ability. They could have gone for focusing, which I think it would have been much more effective, for example, but in comparison with Diablo 3 or Titan Quest or other isometric action RPG games with an isometric camera, for example, Lineage 2 allows you to focus, but the enemy density of Sacred 2 is that of an isometric action RPG when compared to MMORPG games. So there are many more maps, very similar to Hellgate Land and Borderlands and Diablo, rather than World of Warcraft, which is more individual targets. So in that sense, I would have still, I think that it would have still been more objectively accurate to have a focus system, so the player presses a button and a single enemy will be targeted, and simply by casting the spell, the area of effect is around it. In that case, it would be an intermediate solution. For example, in the case of Diablo 3, for example, you don't focus, you just jump from one enemy to the other, but the thing is that the point and click physics and mechanics there are extremely accurate. In Sacred 2, it definitely took me a while to get used to. At the end of the day, I could be precise with the game, but never as precise as a full-fledged MMORPG. As a direct comparison, I would say Lineage 2's targeting system with the same isometric camera is better in that sense. That would be the most prominent flaw out of all of the gameplay mechanics. So don't be fooled, people, just because I'm highlighting this flaw. As for the rest, it's absolutely amazing, as you'll see in a second. So, as the fourth element, we've already covered the elemental system and the abstract complexity of using it defensively and offensively with the dissociated loot system, pretty much the targeting system, and pretty much enemy variety as well, and how the combat mechanics affect enemy variety in the case of this game and their relationship. Let's get into the fourth element, people, and I won't do another recap because I think I won't remember all of the elements just using my mind. I'll try to, but well. Pretty much the fourth element of the gameplay mechanics would be the stat system. Well, here it's so immense that I think not even I can cover it, but I'll do my best effort to do so. Pretty much, Sacred 2 has a myriad of stats. It has a myriad of stats so big, it has so many stats, so many secondary stats, that you cannot even begin to imagine the abstract complexity that, on top of the other two that I originally mentioned of the elemental system, it adds to the gameplay mechanics. Let's have the elemental system already analyzed. Let's get into the stats that are not part of the elemental system, both offensively and defensively. Well, here we can see the influence. Of the classic RPG genre. As a quick reference, I can name you Baldur's Gate 1, 2, Icewind Dale, Torment Tides of Numenera as a more modern example, Pillars of Eternity, Tyranny, etc., 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 Drakensang. We need to play that one. And with that, I can name you. I can definitely tell you that here we can see the perfect influence of the classic RPG genre in the complexity of the non-elemental stat system. Let's get it to a more down-to-earth example of this theory. When you perform an attack, there's a lot of variables that are taken into account. In modern games, we don't see this abstract complexity. Why? Because the modern RPG genre has strayed away, it has dissociated itself from the influence of classic tabletop Dungeons and Dragons. However, the classic RPG genre that I'm mentioning, Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, Tyranny, Pillars of Eternity, etc., 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 those games didn't fully dissociate from the classic tabletop Dungeons and Dragons system. Not even Morrowind dissociated from it, being much more modern and being released on 2002 or 2001. So just like Morrowind, in Sacred 2, and just like in Baldur's Gate and in the classic RPG genre, in Sacred 2, when the player performs an attack, or when the NPC, when the mob performs an attack, there's a dice roll, a probability of hitting the mob, or in the case of the mob, hitting the player, of that attack landing. There's a sense of accuracy and evasion, two stats that are taken into account in the game and that the player can modify. So there's accuracy, something that we don't see in modern RPG games, that adds an extra layer of abstract complexity, and it adds the concept of evasion, another stat that we don't see in modern games. Now, you must be thinking, Eraser, right, two stats that we can stumble upon in Baldur's Gate or a lot of other classic RPG games. Well, if on top of that we add the fact that Sacred 2 has so many other defensive and offensive stats, at the end of the day we get as a result that this is one of the most complex gameplay systems of all time, and I'm not exaggerating. You have, on top of evasion chance and accuracy for both the player and the mobs, you have reflection chance, evasion chance, for example, besides the 5 elemental resistances, you have also a chance for death blow to multiply the amount of damage once the mob's health drops below a certain percentage. We also need to take into account that reflection is broken down between ranged reflection and melee reflection. The same goes for evasion, melee evasion and ranged evasion. If we take all of that into account, I cannot begin to describe you people the insane amount of variables that are taken into account when the player either uses an ability or performs a basic attack. So that extra layer of complexity was implemented on top of the elemental system that I have already mentioned, that it already I already described, it has its own complexity. So if we take all of that into account, that the player, besides all of that, can evade, reflect, can also block attacks, block ranged and block melee, we get a pretty similar system to a tabletop Dungeons and Dragons influenced game. Much more similar to Baldur's Gate, much more similar to, for example, in Morrowind this is implemented but it's invisible to reduce visual complexity. The same happens in Sacred 2. In that sense, it's an inherited element from Morrowind. It hides the underlying complexity, but it retains the degree of abstract complexity of the game. So, if we take all of that into account, so many stats, there are many more, like, well, I don't know, there's so many, like chance to halve your regeneration times, reducing your regeneration per hit for a specific amount of seconds, which we'll get into in a moment, and many more stats, enhancing a specific type of elemental damage, like enhancing fire damage by 10%, I don't know, millions of stats. We could spend the whole analysis, just analyzing the stats of this game, how the stat system of this game works. It's a steep learning curve that it took me a lot of time to figure out, So definitely, this game, only the stat system adds a layer of complexity that makes it objectively superior when compared to a lot of other RPGs that you will stumble upon nowadays. So we have a complex elemental system, a complex stat system, both of them used offensively and defensively, a dissociated loot system of the game, which we'll get into soon. But that's not all. That's not all that makes this game unique. That's not all. The skill tree system has a higher abstract complexity than your average MMORPG, classic RPG, or isometric action RPG. Generally, the modern approach to skill trees, and let's get into the fifth element of the analysis. Generally, skill trees work like this. You progressively unlock base abilities as you level up your character in World of Warcraft or in Diablo, and through the skill tree you modify those original abilities, right? It just works like that. That's a typical mental model of a skill tree. This game incorporates the concept of sub-branches inside the branches of the skill tree. They're actually the branches are called the aspects. Pretty much I had three: the Gruesome Inquisition, the Netherworld, and the Netherworld, and one more that I don't remember the name. Pretty much you have three branches of your skill tree with different abilities in each of them. But those sub-branches, in those sub-branches you can modify in those main three aspects. Let's call them the three main aspects, the three main branches. In those three main branches you can modify the abilities in a pretty similar way as you would do in a normal MMORPG. But besides that, you have two sets of three modifications per ability of the skill tree. There's roughly 6 abilities per branch of the skill tree. You can combine them. You are actually encouraged to combine them. You have passive abilities and offensive abilities, and active abilities, pretty much, and you can modify them through two. They are called the technical denomination. It's the enhancement. To the skill tree. But besides the enhancements, that's the usual way that we deal with skill trees in modern games. We have the sub-branches. This is that I've been calling the sub-branches in the game. They are called attributes, pretty much. They are called skills, which aren't attributes. So see that it has so many concepts that you can mix them up just using your memory. The skills are basically points that you use to enhance either the damage or the regeneration times of your abilities, besides modifying their base effects like you would normally do in a normal modern RPG, just like in World of Warcraft, for example. You also can directly, through the skill system, modify, which I call the sub-branches. The skill trees. The skill system is the sub-branches. You can enhance the base damage of those abilities, and you can enhance the regeneration time of those abilities, and some extra things like enhancing your armor, which you need to master at the beginning of the game, otherwise you will get killed immediately, increasing your elemental resistances generally, like that. From there you can do it. That's why it's much more restrictive. Your evasion chance, your accuracy, pretty much. You can, for example, there's another element which is the fact that you have a god ability. According to the god that you selected at the beginning of the game, you have to kind of like be aligned with a god at the beginning of the game, and you can cast that god's ability. In my case it was Cesta, the god of science, and I could do an area of effect attack for some 10 seconds, and the cooldown for that one is extremely huge. You can, for example, through Divine Devotion, reduce the cooldown times specifically of those specific branches of the skill tree through this skill sub branches, right? So pretty much, you can enhance base damage, regeneration time of abilities, and defense, attacks, pretty much other things. For example, you can enhance your basic attack damage, those things. You get weapon proficiencies as well here, and a myriad of other things. For example, bargaining, riding, PvP stats, those things. There are many more things. And on top of that, in terms of finishing with, it's also part of the skill tree system of the game. So we have the skill tree, the enhancement system of a skill tree through which you modify the skills, just like you do in normal MMORPGs and modern RPGs. You have the skill system, which modifies the base damage, regeneration, and some other stats of the skill tree and your character overall. And you also have the attributes branch of the skill tree. So it's actually four systems in one. It could be three if you don't consider the enhancement system separately, but it's three systems in one, seamlessly combined. So the attributes, which are basically the typical, the classic strength, intelligence, agility, etc. for your character. There's a twist. In terms of the attribute system of the game, which is the fact that it strays from something that I mentioned. I think that one of the most important parts of the stat system as well of this game, which is the fact that this game doesn't follow the paradigm of min-maxing as a stat system. Quite interesting. In order to get into this, we need to define what min-maxing is. Typically, when you are playing a video game, normally you are encouraged to min-max. Min-maxing is the phenomenon in which the player is able to be efficient in combat by the mere enhancement of base attack damage. Pretty interesting. Diablo 3 uses this concept. A lot of modern RPG games use this concept, and it's a huge flaw that Sacred 2 doesn't have, because that reduces the abstract complexity that I've been talking about. Min-maxing, if you think about it, in Diablo 3, what do? You enhance your base attack damage, and there's always a secondary stat, the same with Hellgate London and Borderlands. You just enhance critical chance, and that increases the frequency of your proccing of abilities, the chance of triggering, for example, a secondary element like, I don't know, critical hits or elemental damage like fire or whatever. Min-maxing is a flaw that is encouraged nowadays, and I think it's terrible because it's plain one-dimensional. Sacred 2 is the exact opposite. It solves the problem of min-maxing. It does solve the problem of min-maxing in a pretty amazing and elegant way, because the player is encouraged to evenly distribute his attribute points, not only the skills and the enhancements of the skill tree. The player is encouraged to organically and naturally distribute his stat points. For example, and let's get to the down-to-earth example and the consequences that this has. For example, at the beginning of the game, at the beginning of the series, I started just playing just investing points on intelligence, thinking that this was like Diablo, right? So I would only invest attribute points on intelligence to increase my basic attack damage. Pretty much damage with staves. And I thought like that I could beat the game, right? Because I had the mindset of playing Diablo. Pretty much, I discovered that I would have never been able to possibly finish this game, to complete this game, with a mindset of min-maxing. Why? Because Sacred 2 encourages the player, naturally, to evenly distribute his stats. You'll see. I started playing, I increased my basic attack damage, I put all points on intelligence. First world boss. We stumbled upon the first world boss of the game, and pretty much Since I didn't invest a single point on defense value, which is a posh naming convention for evasion in this game. It has a lot of naming conventions inherited from Dungeons and Dragons. For example, since I didn't have evasion, I wouldn't evade any attack from the world boss, and the world boss would basically kill me in 1 or 2 blows. The same goes for even the most basic of mobs. It happened to me in the Ghost Dragon world boss fight, pretty much the first huge world boss fight that I had. I had that problem. I got definitely killed several times. I sucked at the game at the beginning because of that. Because I didn't understand the attribute system, of the game. And I tried to min-max. I employed the min-maxing philosophy, and the game erected a barrier of complexity between my understanding and its elemental system. The fact that it erects that barrier of complexity in terms of the learning curve has a lot of consequences that we'll get into right now. But just so you have a reference, so we can finish the concept, I wouldn't be able to survive in the most basic of encounters by just min-maxing, by just increasing my base attack damage and a secondary stat. It's impossible because world bosses would kill you in 1 blow. When I discovered that I had to invest points on defense, and I managed to respec through a program called Character Editor, which allows you to respec, which is terrible that the game doesn't allow you to respec naturally. When I was able to respec through that program, I basically realized through reading the forums that you had to evenly distribute your stats, and that defense value was actually evasion, and attack value was actually accuracy. So I had to increase my accuracy so my attacks would land, because see the conundrum, I had a high base attack damage, but my attacks wouldn't land. It's an extra layer of complexity. The same goes for defense. I had a lot of attacks, but I wouldn't be able to survive in even the most basic of encounters. So pretty much I had to learn about evasion to evade enemy attacks, and that wasn't enough, because even if I could evade most enemy attacks during mid-game gameplay mechanics, when I went up against, for example, the Garganthropod or other dragons, there would be attacks that could kill me in 1 blow, regardless of my evasion chance, because no matter how good it is, there will always be, in a long fight, 1 attack that will connect, and the second that attack connects, it will kill you in 1 blow, unless you spend points on vitality. If you increase your total amount of health. This is a concept that is so lost nowadays, to the point that we don't even think about the last RPG that you played, people, and tell me when was the last time you had to actually think about defensive stats in general, but especially increasing your total amount of health of your character. I bet it's been a long while until you have done that, guys, if you think about it. Nowadays, we don't even spend a single second worrying about our defense and worrying about our in a game, in an RPG, worrying about our defensive stats, and even less so about our total amount of health. This game found a way to make health relevant again, which I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant how Sacred 2 manages stats, because it encourages a balanced distribution of attributes of your stats that will encourage a much higher abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics. That's the fascinating thing about this game. That's absolutely fascinating about this game. So, and the stat system it has. So the fact that it ignores, that it breaks, that it overcomes the conundrum of min-maxing as a paradigm of the stat system of modern RPGs, I think that alone it's enough as to also as well consider that another one of the crowning achievements of the game. So you will evenly distribute your stats, and that has a lot of consequences. It has a bunch of consequences that heavily influence the rest of the aspects of the game that I wanted to cover. But pretty much, just so you have a reference, this game doesn't follow the golden rule of the classic Blizzard system of being easy to learn, hard to master. This game is hard to master right from the very beginning, and it will encourage an even distribution, a balanced distribution of stats. Pretty much. This has a lot of consequences that most reviewers won't even pay attention to at all, and they are extremely important. This has an impact on the economic system of the game, which is in this case directly related to the learning curve of it. So get ready, because this is a very deep and long topic that we need to cover. How do I put it? Generally, difficulty in games, it's one-dimensional, and it's dissociated from the economic system of the game. It's dissociated from the economic system of the game. One prominent exception of this, and the very reason the game I'm about to mention is so successful, is the Dark Souls series. But no one gets into the psychological reasons as to why Dark Souls is so successful in a lot of cases. Why? Because Dark Souls has a two-dimensional relationship between the economic system and the gameplay mechanics. Pretty weird concepts that we'll go over slowly but surely. And Sacred 2 does the same. Generally. Let's begin with the reward punishment system, and then let's continue with the relationship between the usage of potions and the gameplay mechanics that I always mention. But first, the reward punishment system that is related to the gameplay mechanics. It's a domino effect. Let's assume we have already covered the stat system. Let's assume that we're in the early game gameplay mechanics of this game. We have started playing the game, or the mid-game gameplay mechanics. Like, this is what happened to me, so I know the psychological process. I start playing the game, I don't understand that this balance of stats, that the game doesn't use min-maxing as a paradigm of its abstract complexity of the stat system. It doesn't use min-maxing as a paradigm. As I said, you don't need to worry about defensive stats in most games, but the fact that this game forces the player to distribute his attributes, his stats, in a balanced way, erects a barrier that I mentioned previously, a psychological barrier, which creates a domino effect, in which there we can see the relationship between the gameplay system and the reward punishment element of the economic system of the game. Let's begin with a down-to-earth example in this category of the gameplay category of the analysis. Let's begin with a down-to-earth example. The player doesn't understand the stats. Let's reverse engineer our experience in these 40 days. The player doesn't understand the stat system. The player decides to min-max as a direct consequence of his previous experience while playing Diablo 2 or Diablo 3 or any isometric action RPG you could possibly think of, and the player decides to min-max, right? As I've said, the player will be ineffective in combat as a direct consequence of min-maxing as a paradigm of the stat system. The player will come with that chip, with that mindset, and the player will get killed. The player will get killed constantly because he went for min-maxing, as I did at the beginning of the series, all points on base damage and a secondary stat like proccing a critical chance or triggering an elemental effect, and the world boss will kill the player in one blow. Perfect. That causes the domino effect that I've been mentioning. The player will be inefficient in combat, And the second the player is inefficient in combat, this game activates a pretty interesting element of its economic system. It creates, I know it's a very abstract concept for those of you watching this as a YouTube VOD, but if you watch my gameplay, you'll realize, or if you play the game, you'll realize, the game creates a negative income ratio of the in-game currency the second the player is inefficient in combat. There's the relationship. There's the third crowning achievement of the gameplay system of this game. There's a direct relationship between the economic system and the gameplay mechanics. The player will be inefficient, and it will create a negative economic ratio. What will that cause? It will cause, in layman terms, that the amount of gold that the player will loot from mobs when not understanding the stat system of the game, that's why the domino effect, it will cause that the amount of money that the player gets from farming negative. The player will spend more gold buying potions than the amount of gold that he will get from farming, from beating even the most basic of enemies. It doesn't need to be a world boss. Creating that negative ratio. Eventually, this has only one possible outcome that the developers over at Ascaron, and that's why I said that they are masters of the genre, knew about. It has only one outcome. The gold of the player will go down to 0. Eventually. It happened to me several times, even in mid-game gameplay periods. Even when I had already mastered the basic stats of the game. The income, that negative ratio, that negative proportion, the player will constantly lose gold. Eventually, it will get to 0 if he's inefficient in combat. It creates that negative ratio. That's the mastery of the economic system and its influence on the gameplay mechanics. And that will cause the player to be unable to buy potions eventually. The only possible outcome. You are at 0 and you cannot buy potions. If you are inefficient in combat and you don't understand the stat system. So the reward punishment system is multi-dimensional. It's not one-dimensional, and that's a huge difference. Just to establish a direct comparison, Dark Souls is so successful because of this element, because of the influence of the economic system on the gameplay mechanics. Let's get to another aspect of this. In most isometric action RPGs you played, people think about all of them, MMORPG, More RPG, the last one you played. When you go up against a world boss, and you get killed, and you fail, what did you lose? You generally only lose one-dimensional, the cost of opportunity. This is an economic concept applied to this. The cost of opportunity. You just lost the opportunity to get all of that juicy and beautiful loot from the boss, and the time you spent trying to kill it. You try again, and that's it. Dark Souls is so successful because of this psychological influence of the player of having a two-dimensional loot system. Not only you lost the time in Dark Souls of going up against the boss, spending a lot of time, and not being able to get the loot, the cost of opportunity, the loot that you didn't get, or for example in Pokemon, the Pokemon that you didn't catch if you failed, that you didn't catch if you failed, and the time you spent trying to achieve that goal. In Dark Souls, there's also a currency system implemented into that. You lose your souls, and you have to go back to your corpse, just like in World of Warcraft. In that case, instead of an in-game currency, what's in play. It's the durability of your gear if you respec at the cemetery instead of going to your corpse. But there's a second dimension. That's why I say it's a multi-dimensional. The influence of the economic system on the gameplay mechanics. In Dark Souls, you have to go back to your corpse, recover your souls. If you get killed before recovering those souls, you lose them. There's an economic damage to the player expectations, right? To the psychological expectations of the player from the game. This is the key to success of Dark Souls that most reviewers generally don't psychologically analyze. That is a multi-dimensional reward punishment element in the economic system of the game directly linked to the gameplay mechanics. Let's get to the case of Sacred 2. The player doesn't understand the gameplay mechanics. The negative economic ratio is one element of this. But it's handled differently. As I've said, let's compare both systems. Instead of going to your corpse, like in Dark Souls or World of Warcraft, for in-game currency, like the souls or the degradation of your gear in World of Warcraft, here the player has a very unique element, which is the second dimension. As I've said, the negative ratio that it will eventually lead the player to have 0 gold and be unable to buy potions. And the second element is the internal clock system of Sacred 2. See how incredibly high the abstract complexity of this game is on all aspects. I've already covered the gameplay mechanics of the elemental system inside of the gameplay mechanics and the stat system. And see, we're talking about the economic complexity influence on the gameplay mechanics. The internal clock system. In this game, when you get killed, there's an internal clock system that gets reset. It gets automatically reset after you get killed. So, you lost the normal cost of opportunity, you spent time going up to the boss, which they are generally pretty difficult to access, you have to do a long journey generally. So, you lost the time that you spent going to the boss, trying to kill it, you didn't get the loot as well, so you lost the cost of opportunity, the loot and the time. You eventually, if this is repeated, if this happens several times, you get that negative economic ratio, you start losing money. Third consequence, the internal clock system is reset. When the internal clock system is reset, the amount of gold that you will loot in the next 2 hours, 3 hours, I don't have the exact timings of the internal clock system, but you can generally see that after you get killed, make this measurement, see that the gold that you will loot and the quality of the loot will be much lower. If you watch my gameplays right from the beginning, you'll see in which I died a lot. I died 63 times at the beginning. Then I mastered the mechanics of the game. The internal clock system of this game will drop the gold from 7,000 to from 70,000 or 30,000 per loot to 400 or something like that, effectively making that economic influence even more prominent. We could say that Sacred 2 is the epitome of a perfect implementation of an economic reward/punishment system on the gameplay mechanics. It's pretty much the epitome of a perfectly implemented influence between those two elements, thanks to this internal clock system. If I had to establish a comparison, this system is superior when compared to Dark Souls, because as you can see, the degree of efficiency of the integration of the reward punishment system is higher when compared to Dark Souls or World of Warcraft, because in those games you just have to go back to your corpse and that's it. In this game, it's a continuous process. There's a component of being a continuous process, not I lost at that boss and that specific moment. It's in those games, it's kind of like how do I put it? Static. It's a static. You lost at that one boss, you go back to your corpse and it will be that specific situation in an isolated way. In this game, this is actually called a preclusive system. It's continuous. Preclusive means that it activates constantly at different points, like one after the other. And it's the case with this game. It's continuous. If you lose against a mob, the clock, the internal clock will be reset, and there's a risk of that happening. Very much the same as with a world boss if you don't understand the stat system. So that element of being continuous, when compared to the static system in those games, creates a higher degree of efficiency in terms of the influence of the reward/punishment element of the economic system of the game, a much more efficient influence on the gameplay mechanics. I know they are all extremely abstract concepts, but they explain at the end of the day why the psychological sense of progression of this game is much more effective than others, and why this game is more effective at creating that addiction that professional gaming reviewers usually talk about without getting to the logical underlying causes behind it. It's not just that the game is good or bad according to being addictive or not. It's a psychological sense of progression that it creates on the player, and in this case, it has the highest degree of efficiency at creating that psychological sense of progression on the player's mind because of the high degree of efficiency of the economic system on the gameplay mechanics. You have three elements that will completely link, they will completely relate, they will stick together: the economic system of the game and the gameplay mechanics of it, with a direct influence. As the next element of the analysis, as the sixth element that we should pay attention to, as the sixth element, we have already covered the stat system, pretty much enemy variety, pretty much everything that the game has going on in terms of the elemental system, used both offensively and defensively, min-maxing as a paradigm, all of the things that we've analyzed in the previous 40 days. But there are even more elements to it. The complexity of the skill tree. There are even more elements. The relationship between since we are talking about the economic system, let's include this other element that I treated at the beginning of the series, that I always analyze at the beginning. The relationship between the usage of potions and the gameplay mechanics. Since we are talking about the economic system, the fourth relationship, the fourth influence of the economic system, of the abstract complexity of the mental model of the economic system on the gameplay mechanics, is the relationship between the usage of potions and the gameplay mechanics. This one is pretty much present in all games throughout history. It's a common denominator that we can find across all games, pretty much. But that element is quite important because it can break your game completely. It can break the difficulty curve of your game. I always cite as an example, poor game, it's a game that I love a lot, which precisely belongs to the same genre as this one, as an offline isometric MMORPG, Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning. I don't know if you played it, people, you'll tell me over at the YouTube board if you are watching it. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning is the perfect example of how a bad relationship between the usage of potions and the gameplay mechanics can completely break your game. In that game, regardless of how terrible, how bad your skill tree might be, how bad you might be at the game, how much you could ignore the stat system and the abstract complexity of the gameplay mechanics, doesn't matter. You'll be able to finish Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning without any kind of difficulty just by spamming potions. Why? Because it doesn't have a countermeasure against potion spamming. A sin, definitely a sin, a terrible flaw that a lot of games have nowadays. There are ways to mitigate this. Generally, Diablo 3 adds a cooldown to the usage of potions. Hellgate London adds silencing the player as a mechanic to counter this. For example, a lot of enemies and world bosses will silence the player, and casting and using a health injector, a potion, is considered an ability, and as a direct consequence of the silence, the player is unable to use the health injector and can get the player killed. That's the formula of Hellgate London. There are different ways, as you can see: cooldowns, silencing the player and considering it an ability. There are different ways to mitigate the potion spamming, the relationship between the usage of potions and the gameplay mechanics. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, I hope they fixed it in the re-reckoning remaster that they did. I haven't played it, I played the original on the PS3, so, and there I can tell you that I beat the game just spamming potions, even if my skill tree was decent. That destroys difficulty, it destroys the difficulty curve of the game, and as I always say, the second you destroy the difficulty curve of the game, you are destroying the exponential enhancement of that psychological sense of progression on the player, because if the game is way too easy, there isn't that feeling of challenge. Well, Let's get to the case of Sacred 2. Now that we've defined the problem, the conundrum of the relationship between the usage of potions and the gameplay mechanics. How does Sacred 2 fixes it? Sacred 2 doesn't have a cooldown. It doesn't have a cooldown for potions. And the most incredible, the fascinating aspect of it is that the very same economic system that I mentioned previously, that's why I wanted to leave these two topics for the, let's say, relatively the end of the gameplay category of the analysis. Pretty much, it's related directly with these other three elements that I commented about the economic system of the game, the reward punishment system. The developers over at Ascaron created an economic system that, as I've said, erects a barrier, a psychological barrier, in which they can perfectly check if the player understands the stat system. If the player understands the stat system of the game, there will be a positive ratio of in-game income, and the player will be able to accumulate a fortune, and won't have any problems, and will be able to spam potions. But notice that if that doesn't happen, if the player doesn't understand the stat system, the player won't be able to buy potions, and as I've said, eventually it'll get to 0, and that's pretty much it. It forces the player to learn the stat system. It's a cycle. So the relationship between the usage of potions and the gameplay mechanics in Sacred 2, it's a secondary effect of the framework that is the economic system of the game. And since the economic system of the game has a high degree of efficiency of erecting barriers that will prevent progress if you don't understand the stat system, directly that allows to that the direct consequence of that is that the player will have a perfect relationship between the usage of potions and the gameplay mechanics. The player won't be able to spam potions, in layman terms. The player won't be able to spam potions because the very same economic system will force him to understand first the stat system of the game. And even if he does, a lot of world bosses can kill you in one blow if you don't understand the concepts of all of the stats that I've mentioned: reflection chance, evasion chance, your total amount of health pool of health, your vitality, etc, etc, etc. The stat system and the economic system, both of this game, naturally fix the relationship between the issue of potions and the gameplay mechanics. Sacred 2 doesn't need cooldowns for potions and doesn't need silencing, because world bosses can kill you in one blow if you don't understand evasion. Because if you don't understand the stat system, even mobs will create that negative ratio of the economic system of the game, and the player won't be able to buy them at all. You have different types of potions. I didn't use them, that enhance experience and other things, but basically the main conundrum is the health potion. Indiscriminately spamming health potions in this game is properly addressed. Quite important because it can break your game. You have the perfect example in Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, poor game that I always cite it as an example because it's pretty evident. I love that game, but it's pretty evident. Right, people. Right. In terms of the gameplay mechanics of the game, I think we have addressed everything. In terms of the world bosses, there's amazing variety, not only enemy variety in terms of the mobs. World bosses each have their own mechanics. They have area of effect attacks, and definitely they contribute to this domino effect that I have been mentioning. Once again, this is the third crowning achievement of the game. Besides the abstract complexity of the elemental system, besides the amazing combination of enemy variety and etc., it's a domino effect. Player doesn't understand the stat system, negative economic ratio, perfect integration within the gameplay mechanics. Economic ratio causes the player eventually to not be able to buy potions, and the cycle restarts, and the internal clock system is reset, so the player will loot less gold, and the direct consequence is that the player won't be able to progress through the game. The economic system, once again, goes back, and the cycle is restarted. The player is encouraged to organically and naturally learn the gameplay mechanics of the game. It goes back to square one through the economic system in a continuous way. So yes, it's a perfectly designed system that you don't see nowadays it's always important to pay attention to how unique, in terms of innovation as well, that we'll get to eventually, how unique this is, how uncommon it is. There's another thing. There's another thing, because I mentioned that this game has a defensive system implemented to it. There's a defensive system. When we analyze min-maxing as a paradigm, I described this at the end of that part of the series. When you have min-maxing as a paradigm, it has another negative effect in terms of the gameplay mechanics. Because think about Diablo 3, think about the last isometric action RPG that you played. When you have min-maxing as a paradigm of the stat system, in the framework of the stat system, one small last note before we proceed with the rest, you are allowing the player to kill when you allow the player to kill mobs faster than the amount of time required to create a defensive system with all of the stats that I mentioned, that I won't mention again, with reflection, evasion, blocking, etc., your overall health pool, elemental resistances, you are effectively eliminating 50% of the gameplay mechanics. Because if you think about it, player interaction is attack and defense. When you allow the player, like in Diablo 3, to kill mobs faster than the amount of time required to create a defensive system, you are eliminating 50% of the gameplay mechanics. So see how it was linked at the end of the day, the abstract complexity of implementing a defensive system and an elemental system in the gameplay, in the consequences, the impact it has on the gameplay mechanics of the game. See how all elements of the gameplay mechanics in Sacred 2 are inherently perfectly combined within each other. They are perfectly integrated. The degree of efficiency of the integration of the gameplay mechanics is one of the highest I've ever seen, because of everything that I've explained in this first hour of the analysis. We did the intro at the beginning. So, I think I've covered all aspects. I think that by now I covered all aspects of the gameplay mechanics. Of course, if you are watching this as a YouTube pod, in the future you will have visual reference. It's an extremely complex system to explain, but as I've said at the beginning, I do my analysis unscripted, and with a bit of patience and dissecting all of these concepts, we can get to the metaphysical reality of all of the gameplay elements. And as you could see, they all had logical reasons to be considered objectively superior when compared to the average modern RPG game. If I remember any other gameplay element that I might have missed, we'll get back to this category, but I think I covered everything in this hour. So let's get to the second category of the analysis, generally the one that I spend the least time on, but in this case we'll have to talk about some things. As a quick breakdown, we begin with the technical category of the analysis. As I said, if I've forgotten something about the gameplay mechanics, we'll go back to, but I think I covered everything. Pretty much the stat system, skill tree, everything. In terms of the technical aspect of it, a basic breakdown. I will first begin with the graphical effects and then with the objective technical performance. In terms of the graphical effects, what could I tell you about this game? As I've said in my previous stream, it's a pretty unique case, because generally the purpose, and here you can see the perfectionist mentality of the developers over at Ascaron, generally, and here I will use World of Warcraft as a comparison, generally, see how interesting the psychological process is. MMORPGs, the main objective of an MMORPG is to create an online community straight up, right from the beginning. That's the main objective. Create an online community, so there's a feedback loop between all of them, and your community grows. Your online community of the game grows. This is the first thing that I will highlight, that I realized in the previous stream, in the last one that we did with the final boss, which is the fact that it's poetic, it's absolutely noble, it's an absolute noble philosophy, you'll see, pretty similar to what happened to Alpha Dream with the development of the Mario and Luigi series, when they developed the last one. Now that we know that there will be a successor, but when they developed the last game, they knew that they were going bankrupt. They psychologically prioritized quality over the very own existence of the studio. That's a noble mindset and noble development philosophy that we don't get every day. See how it's directly linked to the psychological effects reviewing games, pretty much when you do it objectively with a metaphysically realist stance. And in the case of Sacred 2, it's pretty similar to the Mario and Luigi series and Alpha Dream. They prioritize, and we can see it in the technical aspect, that's why I'm citing it. They prioritized technical quality over their own interest, over their own existence as a game company. Why? Because what most MMORPGs do, what most MOBAs do, is to create an online community as fast as they can. And in order to do that, most online games have terrible graphics. And when I say terrible graphics, I'm referring to the physics, to the graphical effects, to everything. There are even add-ons for World of Warcraft that fix old school graphical effects. You can see evidence of this, you can see the alibi. For example, in World of Warcraft, when they changed the animations after the Wrath of the Lich King expansion or something like that. In my case, since I run privately, I don't showcase it on stream generally, an offline reverse engineered Wrath of the Lich King server, I had to implement an add-on to add the graphical effects of post Cataclysm expansion. You can get the point. And in Cataclysm, they rearranged the game world, they added a lot of graphical effects and those things. There you have the alibi, empirical evidence that MMORPGs generally put as a first objective creating online community, and they don't care about the technical aspects of the. That's why I also include this category for the graphical effects. What's the case of Sacred 2? Developers that acted like kamikazes in a pretty noble way that we should always value and admire and look up to, because they prioritized technical quality above their own existence. They prioritized it above all, at the top of their list of ideas. This game implements. Let's begin with the graphical effects. This game implements one of the most advanced physics engine using the technology of the NVIDIA Fix engine. Pretty much, they had to sell elite textures separately of this game because of how massive they were. The grass moves constantly. It reacts to the player when he's walking on. The blades of grass pretty much react to the player. All of this on a game that was released back in 2008. This game has more advanced graphics than World of Warcraft, than Morrowind, than Borderlands, etc, etc, etc. In World of Warcraft, grass didn't react back then. I don't know about now, but it didn't react back then to player interaction when the player is walking. For example, in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, you can see that it reacts. There are modern games in which grass doesn't react doesn't have physics implemented to it, and when the player walks, that you don't see the weight of the player on the grass. And the same goes for the trees in this game. And not only that, we have to go further beyond. We have to go even further beyond. This game has particle effects. For example, my passive buffs or my attacks, it has particle effects that World of Warcraft didn't have back then, that a lot of isometric action RPGs didn't have back then. As a quick comparison, World of Warcraft and Titan Quest, they don't have the amount of graphical density of the heavy load of the graphical quality of this game. Other things that I wanted to mention, besides the only because of the physics engine, it's superior. It's probably, there are some games, just using my memory here, that implement the NVIDIA Fix engine back from this period of time. That's why you have to install a legacy driver to this game for them to work. Just using my memory, let me think, they were XCOM The Bureau Declassified, which is a spin-off of the XCOM series, which is similar to Gears of War. You also have the, of course, Batman Arkham Asylum in the case of the smoke of Batman Arkham Asylum, of the first one in the series or in the franchise, it has NVIDIA smoke with realistic physics. That's why you'll see that it's better than smoke even in modern games. And Hand of God, I think it was another unknown isometric action RPG that had that, a pretty similar system to this one. So it has an advanced physics engine that not even modern games have. Textures that have an amazing quality. They could easily pass as modern. This could easily pass as a modern game, easily. Water physics that I have seldom seen in my life. Seldom seen. Only, for example, you can see their relationship. Batman Arkham, the last one, Arkham Knight, has pretty good water effects. But I don't think it has physics implemented to it. But it's pretty good, pretty similar to this one. Amazing water physics. And besides the water physics, we are also talking about that everything in this game engine is absolutely advanced when we are considering the release date, the original release date of this game. Let's get to the other aspect. Let's get to the other aspect, because it's not just graphical effects and physics and everything, the technical aspect. And here's the second flaw that I'm going to highlight: the technical state of the game, people. While, as I've said, some viewers have told me that over at the PS3 and the Xbox 360 version of the game doesn't crash, which those are good news. The PC version, as you could see, I had technical issues. I tried to fix them. I spent a lot of time trying to fix them. You have the guide over at my YouTube channel in case you want to at least achieve the result that you see in my streams, in which I could play the game for 3 to 4 hours without crashing. Sometimes when you enter a new area, for example, this is the technical problem of the game, the memory pipeline gets it starts accumulating caching of the game, and pretty much it explodes like a tube of your toilet or whatever, of your bathroom, and it eventually it accumulates and it explodes. I've tried a lot of fixes. I highly recommend the community patch, because it will also allow you to play both the evil and good side quests of the game. We'll get into that more once we get to the level design category of the analysis. Pretty much it will balance the game a lot, and it will give you a much better experience. The community patch, I only played with the community patch. If you don't want crashes at all, the Xbox 360 version or the PS3 version, but I would still say that even if the PC version crashes from time to time, it's still superior, especially with the community patch, because you have unlocked frame rates and resolution. That's another thing that we should talk about in the technical aspect of the game. So there's a second flaw, just as I mentioned, the lack of relative accuracy of the targeting system when within the gameplay mechanics, which I think is the only flaw of the gameplay mechanics. In terms of the technical aspect, I wanted to highlight the second flaw, that when they released the game, it wasn't, they clearly ran out of budget and they were absorbed by Deep Silver, the talented developers over at Ascaron. They are still in the industry. They are just an internal division of Deep Silver. Check out the first stream that we ever did, in which I went over the history of Ascaron, and pretty much they released the game with those flaws. It was a pretty common situation back in the early 2000s and late 2000s, that the development cycle at the end, they would run out of budget, and they tried to iron out the problems. Consider that this game, it's version 2.65, the gold edition over at Steam, and on top of that 1.6 of the community patch, so a lot of people throughout the years have tried to fix the game. It's not fully fixed in my experience, but at least it's playable. Like, the crash usually happens when you enter a new area for the first time, but a crash every 3 to 4 hours at unlocked frame rates and resolutions, I would take it over 30 FPS over at the 7th generation console release that it had. All in all, those are the two flaws so far. The graphical effects, nothing to say more than what I've already said. Absolutely perfect. The physics system, only because of the physics system and with the elite textures and everything. The elite textures, I had to deactivate them. They were sold separately, but they do cause the crash even sooner. So there you have that problem. It's absolutely a tragedy and sad that this game doesn't get. This game doesn't need a remaster, not other more modern games that get remastered. I mentioned this during the analysis. It definitely, this game requires a remake or a remaster, only a remaster. That's because the base graphics are amazing. But I don't think it will ever happen because of the complexity. They will need to fix. They will need to fix the pipeline memory cache issue. All right, graphical effects, the best of the best for 2008. Remember that I analyzed the graphic effects. We are not doing historical revisionism. We are analyzing it in the context of the generation it was released in. If we are talking about 2008, we are talking about the 7th generation, and no game looks like this. Perfect unlockable frame rates and resolution. It's unusual for this generation. There are a lot of games that cannot even do that, and if on top of that we add the physics system and the graphic effects, it's absolutely majestic, absolutely fascinating. So in terms of the graphics quality, I would say beyond the normal capabilities that you would get from a game from the 8th generation. There's this concept of planned obsolescence. Nowadays this game went far beyond its planned obsolescence in terms of graphics. It looks like a modern game. It looks like a modern game. So let's get to the third category of the analysis. Quite important, and I have a lot of elements to talk about, definitely, because it is the fourth crowning achievement of this game without a doubt. I bet you've seen my map while playing the game, if you've been following the streams or watching them as YouTube bots in the future. If you have seen it, if you get to the Wikia page of the game and you see the interactive map, you'll be surprised, astounded by how massive, how incredibly, utterly massive the overworld of this game is. Consider that on top of that, we have a whole underground network on top of it. This happened with the Dungeons and Dragons Dragon Shard, which is an RTS, always thanks to the main enemy developer of it, that he congratulated me for my analysis of Dungeons and Dragons Dragon Shard. That also implements this idea. Also, Armies of Exigo is another RTS that implements this idea, and The Legend of Zelda, the last one, Tears of the Kingdom, implemented this idea, and a lot of people think, it has an underground network, what a new idea. No, it was implemented way before it. The same with Fortnite. There was a game called Fracture during the 7th generation that also implemented terrain manipulation, which is quite similar to construction. Alright, so there you can see that a lot of gaming ideas already existed, it's just that they are unknown by the majority of the player base. So, let's get to the level design. The crowning achievement, the main element, we can all agree on the fact that the game has a massive game world and the scope and scale of it, the extension of the terrain, it's absolutely beyond all parameters that I could possibly talk about. We're talking about a game on par with World of Warcraft, perhaps a tiny bit smaller. We did a comparison with Scarlet Dragoon, another viewer of the channel, back in the first streams. I think you have them over at YouTube. They have already been published. And the extension of the terrain alone, it's impressive, terrific. You basically get an offline MMORPG just for you, all for you. Absolutely massive. It has online connectivity, but it's not only that. It's not only that. A huge extension of the terrain. But let's get into the development philosophy of the level design. This game falls in a very specific category, which is the fact that it has that massive extension of the terrain while retaining the quality, the high degree of quality of a much smaller game, which is extremely unusual, absolutely unusual. In this game, each town has a lot of details, a lot of quests, a lot of small places, small dungeons, small caves, everything where to go. The high degree of detail of the map is not affected by the extension of the terrain. So we are getting quantity and quality at the same time, a perfect marriage between those two concepts. Dwelling a bit deeper into this topic, I cannot stop mentioning the paradigm of procedurally generated terrain and handcrafted terrain that the division of the Elder Scrolls 2 and the Elder Scrolls 3 established. Pretty much the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall has one of the biggest gaming maps ever created, if not the biggest. It's basically the size of a continent. It's basically the size of all of Europe combined, but it's procedurally generated. The map is procedurally generated. They are the same elements in different locations. When we get to the 6th generation and the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind and Grand Theft Auto 3 are released, there's a shift in the paradigm from procedurally generated world maps to handcrafted world maps. In that sense, we can all agree, I was mentioning this, that the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, the crowning achievement, is achieving that paradigm shift of having handcrafted dungeons that don't simply repeat procedurally generated elements. In a more modern example, for example, the first release of No Man's Sky was all procedurally generated, it was massive, but it had the same flaws as the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall that it had back in the day. So, the formula of Sacred 2, it has the handcrafted philosophy of the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind with the extension of the terrain of the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall. So, a perfect marriage, as I was mentioning, of extension, of quantity and quality, of extension and high degree of detail. This is extremely difficult to achieve even nowadays, so imagine back in 2008, if it was difficult for The Witcher 3, if it was difficult for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, if it was difficult for Skyrim, imagine how difficult it must have been back then. Of course, we cannot say that Sacred 2 invented this paradigm shift, that it achieved this paradigm shift, because it was achieved by Morrowind, but World of Warcraft, it would fall under the same category of World of Warcraft, that a lot of MMORPGs from that period of time expanded upon the idea that the Elder Scrolls 3 and Grand Theft Auto 3 initially had of being the spark of handcrafted game worlds. Precisely. So it expanded upon that idea with the same degree of magnitude as World of Warcraft. So when we establish the comparison with World of Warcraft, it's pretty much the same. But as I said in one of the last streams, this game influences a different genre when compared to the one it belongs to. It belongs to we've already done the genre classification in the intro, see why it was important. It belongs to the offline isometric MMORPG genre, pretty similar to Mythos or Lineage 2, not to the isometric action RPG genre, which we usually call Diablo clones, but it did influence the isometric action RPG genre. It's just that it's not being recognized for it. Think about it. This game was released back in 2008, same year as Diablo 3, right? Tell me, Diablo 3, the extension of the terrain in comparison, it's absolutely linear compared to this game. Sacred 2 puts it's shameful to compare Diablo 3 to Sacred 2 in terms of the extension of the terrain. Here we have a whole fucking continent in comparison, and Diablo 3 it's linear, and it was developed with a much bigger budget, if you think about it. The same budget that created World of Warcraft. So, pretty much, a AA studio went beyond AAA capabilities in terms of level design. So, a direct comparison, Diablo 3 and Sacred 2, regardless of the fact that Diablo 3 isn't an isometric MMORPG, it's technically an action RPG because of the influence of the hack and slash mechanics it has and the pacing of the combat. Pretty much. If we establish a direct comparison, it's shameful for Diablo 3. The degree of details and extension of the terrain in this game It's absolutely impossible to compare. This is objectively superior probably 100 times. Not counting the underground and all of the details. It has world bosses, everything. So that's the first element and the crowning achievement of this game. It combines those two concepts perfectly. Something that not even Diablo 4 achieved, Path of Exile 2 didn't achieve, and if we think about it, modern games like Path of Exile 2, like Ark, for example, Ark would be an MMO, it's not offline, but it's an MMO game with an isometric camera, but it's not isometric action RPG, because it has group-oriented content, so there's the MMO component to it. So Ark, Path of Exile 2, and Diablo 4, see the irony, they are much more similar objectively to Sacred 2 than to Diablo 3. That's why I mentioned that it has a legacy that is not recognized, and that's the sad aspect of it. As I've said, more modern examples like Diablo 4, Path of Exile 2, and as I've said, Last Epoch, for example, or Ark is the perfect example. They are much more similar, or Lineage 2 was they are much more similar to Sacred 2 and Lineage 2 than to Diablo 3. Diablo 3 is linear, it's much more similar to Diablo 2. Precisely, which makes sense. So it has an unrecognized legacy there. Next element of the level design. That I don't want to forget about. I have several of them, but I don't want to precisely forget about this one. Quest variety, and what I always mention, the influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. And this is directly related to quest variety and objectives. In Sacred 2, as I've said, it has 3 times the amount of quests that you'll stumble upon in Borderlands. We're talking about 600 to 700 according if you play a modded or unmodded version. Borderlands 1 has 214 or 216, roughly around that number. So 3 times the amount of quests when compared to Borderlands, and that has a myriad of consequences. First of all, this game has a perfect influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. Why? Because even when you master the stat system of the game and you create that positive economic ratio and you are extremely efficient in combat and blah 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 blah, and you perfectly dominate the game and etc., there's a further layer of difficulty on the gameplay mechanics as a direct link when compared to the level design, the influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. As always, I mention, thanks to the main level designer from Austria, of even Kaspar's Mage, that he praised my analysis of the level design on that game, that he was the main level designer, precisely. Always a huge shout out to him from Austria. Precisely. What I always mention, people, the same happens in Hellgate London. When the player has the opportunity to retreat endlessly, like what happens in a lot of cases in Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls series, you are degrading the psychological effect, the psychological challenge and the difficulty of the game. You're degrading the difficulty of the game. Because as I've said, this game, and this is related to another element, which is casting times, this game has narrow passages and narrow dungeons, pretty similar to even Kaspar's Mage, pretty similar to Hellgate London, which ensure that the player won't have time to maneuver and retreat and cast the spells. This is fascinating. This element always fascinates me, the influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. How different it is to kill a group of mobs, in a massive open world in which the player can simply retreat and the cost of opportunity is degraded. The economic cost of opportunity is degraded because the player can just simply retreat, and that's it. The player can simply escape, like in Skyrim. This game combines both worlds as well, because it has a massive overworld in which you could potentially do that. By the way, that's related to the enemy detection range that I have mentioned, that is quite good. Enemies chase you, they fix on your position and chase you a long distance. In World of Warcraft, they fix on your position, but the amount of time, the amount of distance that they chase you is not that good. For example, Dark Souls fixes this in the case of the bosses by creating a closed environment in which you cannot escape. That's usually the solution, the countermeasure implemented in the case of bosses. So in the case of bosses, World of Warcraft does this as well, and in the case of the overworld, it's not fixed. For a lot of modern games, you can just run away. In the case of Hellgate London, in the case of a lot of other games. For example, in Chromax the Invincible you can run away, but in the overworld of Borderlands you can't run away. Secret 2 follows that same idea, but exponentially improved. Eminently improved. Why? Because it will provide you with a lot of dungeons in which the player won't be able to maneuver and escape a lot of situations like world bosses and etc. Right from the beginning. Right from the beginning you will have dungeon after dungeon after dungeon after dungeon that the player won't be able to escape from. And you also have the overworld for the testing ground, for being able to escape. But even then, the probability of being surrounded by mobs and killed, even when you can endlessly retreat, is higher in this game. It's much higher, and that's an amazing, subtle, but amazing detail. Why? Because it creates a perfect psychological sense of challenge on the player, as I said. People see how everything is perfectly integrated in this game. Mobs in this game can impair your movement. In Hellgate London, it's perhaps a bit more efficiently implemented because they can stun you and you can be silenced, which is highly effective always. I think this is the best formula. So, but in this game they can also impair your movement, and generally the spawn density fixes the problem here. The spawn density of the mobs in this game is quite high, so they will be able to surround the player and kill him, even if we are talking about the overworld. This is exponentially enhanced within dungeons, as I've been saying, so it's perfect. Let's get to the to the other element of the influence of the gameplay mechanics on the player. The objective, the quest objective. There are a lot of quests in this game. I was mentioning this. Sorry, I lost track of my line of reasoning. You get a lot of quests with different objectives in which you have already mastered the gameplay mechanics and everything. So besides being able to be the fact that you can be surrounded and killed even if you understand the gameplay mechanics, it's further enhanced by a second element. As you can see, this is also multidimensional in terms of the abstract complexity of the level design in this case. Which is that even if you master everything, the game, for example, has escort quests. It has a lot of escort quests in which your escortees, whatever you're escorting, an animal or a passenger or whatever, an escortee, someone that needs transportation from one city to another in the game world, it has a health bar and it can die. So, even if the player understood perfectly all of the gameplay mechanics and is efficient in combat and can beat all of the world bosses, the player can still fail the quest objective even after dominating the gameplay mechanics of the game and the stat system and the attribute system and the skill tree, everything that I mentioned at the beginning. See, that's why I always first analyze the gameplay mechanics and then the level design. Even after all of that, your escortee can get killed, and as a direct consequence, you fail the quest. It's an extra layer of complexity, of difficulty, that you don't stumble upon if you just take into account a one-dimensional quest objective variety. If your only objective is to kill 10 mobs, which the game does have, kill 10 mobs, collect 10 bat hearts or things like that, 40 lizard lungs, or the typical, what we usually call fetch quest, which we'll get into a second in terms of the level design. The so-called fetch quests generally don't have a second objective variety. This game perfectly implements objective variety. There are escort quests, there are quests in which you have to search for isolated objects, in which there's a myriad of objectives that add an extra layer of complexity as the result of a relationship between the gameplay and the influence of the level design. Even if you are the master of the universe and your character is all powerful, you are the Omega Chad powerful character with the best loot, your escortee got killed because you were careless, and as a direct consequence of quest variety, of a level design choice, the player still failed the quest. Perfect influence on the gameplay mechanics. Good. In terms of this is a footnote more than anything, in terms of the denomination, the naming convention of calling these fetch quests, I think is terrible. I think it's absolutely terrible, because calling them fetch quests, any quest that isn't part of the main quest, is a terrible naming convention because it puts the emphasis on the lack of a storyline, which is not the case, and not this direct influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. For example, as I've said, what is more important? That's why I think the term side quest is more efficient, or secondary quests or whatever, but not fetch quests, because when we say fetch quests, we are directly implying that it has no story, and it does. In this case, in the case of this game, side quests aren't voiced. They aren't voiced. You have to read them. The main quest is voiced, and pretty much they have different objective variety. It has a high degree of objective variety. Sorry. So the objective variety is the core of the quality that is generally not taken into account in normal game reviews, and I think it's a terrible mistake. Why? Because we call them fetch quests. We use that naming convention because we put the emphasis on the quality of the storyline, which it does have. The game has a lot of side quests and stories amazing, but they are not the main focus. The main focus that we should put a lot of value on is the influence of the level design on the gameplay mechanics. The fact that the objective variety of a game can completely enhance the gameplay mechanics is the important part of it. Just like I mentioned, your escortee can get killed even if you have the best character ever. Good. Next element, the third element in terms of the level design of the game. We've already covered quest variety, the expansion of the overworld, and the overall design philosophy, and everything. Pretty much we cannot ignore the fact that this game implements a level of realism that I have seldom seen. And when I say that, I do mean it, because this game has... It's a one-to-one, I mentioned this in the last stream, it has a one-to-one, not so much in depth, but it's pretty important. It's a one-to-one replica of Europe, with a lot of fantastic elements to it. Of course, it's not a perfect clone of the map. But if you pay attention to it, it has both geographical and weather realism. And in both levels, it has a degree of realism that I haven't seen in a lot of games. And you know what that involves? That involves that the developers of the game, which in this case I will have to mention it because it plays a big role, the developers of the game are German, and they probably knew and had to study the weather conditions and the geography of Europe to create this game. They knew about it, about all of Europe. Why? Because this game, for example, it's a subtle reference. I mean, for me it's not subtle, it's a one-to-one copy, but it's a copy, the game map, of all of Europe. We have seen the Roman Colosseum of my beloved Italy, for example. The initial section would be Italy and Spain and Central Europe. Then the northern section would be Germany and Switzerland and precisely also Poland. Ike, if you are watching, it's all of the let's say the former Prussian Empire territories, all of the German parts of Europe. Then we have the islands at in the northern section, which represent Iceland and Ireland as well. We can see the volcanoes of Iceland in Seraphim Island, and we can see the snow in the northeastern section of Dragon Sea Island, I think it's called in game, that represents Ireland, pretty much. And then we have the swamp, the desert, representing the northern coast of Africa, probably, that is in contact with the southern section of Italy and the ocean in between and everything. No, not the ocean, but you get the point. And pretty much then, in the southwestern section of the map, you have Great Britain as a whole, you have England, pretty much, and it pretty much represents all of those parts of Europe, if you pay close attention, from the Roman Colosseum to the volcanoes of Iceland, etc. But I want to stop in one specific part of the map that I mentioned. how realistic the weather conditions that I mentioned are. Let's focus on the island, the Dragon Sea Island that represents Ireland, for example. It has snow, etc, etc, etc. Have you noticed that in the swamp region of the game, right below what would be Ireland or Dragon Sea Island in this case, have you noticed that there's in the game map there's a set of mountains. There's a set of mountains, and while in Dragon Sea Island there's a snow, for example, in the swamp region, those mountains are there. They're kind of like the northern border, and in the swamp region there's rain constantly. Well, that's a realistic weather condition that we can see in Northern Europe. It's absolutely realistic. You will see that Ireland has a set of mountains, for example, in the west coast of it, and you can see that because of that, and also in England, because of those mountains, the Arctic winds of the Atlantic Ocean that come from the west to the east, they impact on those mountains and they cause snow, but at a certain point then they cause a lot of rain in Northern Europe. See how interesting, how realistic it is that they knew about the real weather conditions that they were replicating. For example, in the zone of Luxembourg, of the Netherlands, even the very same England in the southernmost section, in all of those regions, or in Switzerland, etc. In all of those regions, in Belgium, for example, there are some periods of the year in which you have a lot of rain, right? There you can see the importance that the developer of the game was, that they were German. They understood the real climatic conditions, the real weather conditions of the game map that they were creating. They created realistic weather conditions because that snow impacts on the mountain, and that's what then creates the rain, those rainy sections of Europe, of Northern Europe, for example, because of those mountains, because they act like a barrier that instead of getting snow, you get rain. So we get realistic geography, realistic weather conditions that could have never been replicated. In the case of, it could have been with enough investigation, an American team, or I don't know, an Asian team, or I don't know, in my case South America doesn't even produce a lot of video games, so I will. Other teams could have been able to replicate, but I don't know if the degree of precision achieved in this game could have been replicated so perfectly without that cultural knowledge of both the geography and the weather conditions that they were trying to replicate in a one-to-one copy. And there you can see the positive impact of having, in this case, a European, in this case German developer, for a game that has a European world map. But it's not only that. It's not only that, people. It's not only the precision of that, but also the fact that the game, that in order to achieve this, this is something extremely undervalued nowadays. The amount of research and development required, the amount of investigation required to achieve that degree of precision in terms of the geography and the weather conditions, and also the cohesion of the medieval characters in this case, because it's a fantasy medieval game. The amount of research and development, I wanted to stop a bit on this topic. The amount of research and development and general culture that the developers of the game need to have, it's much higher when compared to other games, because they are making a perfect replica. That's why I say that games like this, they have a much more inherent value when compared to something like Grand Theft Auto 5 or 4, which are just real cities. This game mixes both the concepts of fantasy and realistic geographical and weather conditions perfectly. It's something that most reviewers won't even pay attention to. I'm probably gonna be the only one paying attention to this, but it's quite important because it tells me that the general culture of the developers and the amount of time that they spent in terms of in research and development, doing research and development was much higher, and that's not taken into account nowadays, and that's unfair. The amount of research that this game requires is probably one of the highest ever. It's one of the highest ever. Not only because of that, of realistic geography and weather conditions, but also, and this is related to the grandeur category of the analysis, due to the cohesion, the psychological cohesion of the characters in this game. This is something, well, we'll leave it for the grandeur category of the analysis we'll get into next, but it's related to this topic. So pretty much, let me describe it to you. Pretty much, characters in this game act according to their medieval personalities. For example, this is something that Larian has never mastered due to political reasons or whatever. I won't get into that for now. But Larian, for example, when they developed Divinity Original Sin 1, 2, and Baldur's Gate 3, haven't you noticed that they are like modern 2024 people injected into a medieval setting? Well, in this game, characters are cohesive. There's cohesion between the environment, the medieval environment, and their interactions. They act according to their personalities, culturally and in terms also of the fantasy setting. Each one of them needs to have their own character. For example, the Inquisitor is kind of like a religious crusader and those things. That's perfect. But generally, developers, Larian has this problem, this huge flaw. Generally, characters, if you pay close attention, they do a lot of historical revisionism. They act like injected characters in a medieval setting, like modern people injected in a medieval setting, and that's a flaw. That's an objective flaw, because you are destroying cohesion directly, straight up. It's not a matter of my mental perception. You're destroying cohesion. The character is not acting according to the culture that he's inserted in. That's a huge problem. Next element of the level design that I cannot stop to highlight, people, definitely quite important. As I've said, quest variety, objective variety, the extension of the terrain, pretty much the incredible enemy variety that has been designed for this game. You have an endless amount of enemies of all types. This is also exponentially enhanced due to the influence of the elemental gameplay system of the game that is used both offensively and defensively at the same time. Pretty much, see how the elemental system implemented in this game directly enhances all of the other aspects of all of the other elements of analysis that it has. That tells you once again that the integration is seamless. Right, people. Right, I think I have covered everything from the influence of one level design, from the influence of the economic system, pretty much everything. I think we are done with the level design. You also have dungeons. In terms of the duration of the game, as I've said at the beginning, 168 hours, 7 days. Is quite accurate. The game is endless in terms of content. I knew I was forgetting about something. The difficulty. The objective difficulty, not the difficulty curve overall. The objective difficulty modes of the game. This game combines, just like it combines the perfect extension of the terrain of a procedurally generated game with the high amount of details of a much more smaller game with a high quality. It also combines the difficulty philosophy. See, that's why I always want to think about it before finishing one category. It combines the perfect difficulty of Diablo, of having normal difficulty, silver, gold, medium, etc., having different levels of difficulty. This is fascinating. It combines that philosophy with the philosophy of an expansive open world. What do I mean by this? Think about Skyrim. Skyrim, you can choose a difficulty from 0% to 100%, right? Generally, that's how they handled it. But you can only play once. Pretty much you select 100, you play once, and that's it. In the case of Diablo, you have different types of difficulties, but it's much more linear and small. This game has the expansion of the terrain of World of Warcraft, a bit less, of a Skyrim, of those massive games, with 4 difficulties with 3 difficulties besides with 4 difficulties. The first one is the initial difficulty, with 4 types of difficulty modes. it brings the best from both the MMORPG genre development philosophy of level design in terms of difficulty and the best from the isometric action RPG genre. In the very same vein as, I don't know if Ark has that, if Diablo 4 has that, generally much modern games have that. So different levels of difficulty, for example in World of Warcraft we could talk about mythic difficulty and those things. In Star Wars The Old Republic, my favorite MMO of all time, it was Nightmare difficulty or those things. Or Elite difficulty in Hellgate London, or Hell difficulty in Diablo and Nightmare. It combines that philosophy from the isometric action RPG genre and it perfectly integrates it within a massive open world in which you can keep playing after finishing the main story with 700 quests, that is 3 times the amount of quests in Borderlands. Exponentially increased, exponentially enhanced. You can play through this game 4 times with all of the difficulties, and each time you play through it, you will have the amount of time that you would normally play a massive MMORPG. It brings the best from both worlds, to the table. It brings the best of both worlds to the table. So it's absolutely fascinating. It's fascinating, without a doubt. On top of that, related to this, 4 levels of difficulty with the expansion of the terrain of a massive MMORPG. The classes, if you play the unmodded version of the game, you have 8 classes, in which each class will have the good side quest and the evil side quest. Some of them can do both of them, or can go neutral and choose one. And pretty much it has a moral choice system as well, to have different outcomes in the very same way as Mass Effect and Star Wars The Old Republic and Dragon Age, for example. It implements the best philosophy of BioWare as well. I hope you all can appreciate how fascinating this is. That the game has a moral system. I've criticized this as the third flaw of my analysis, that the moral system that you can choose accept or decline, and there's no visual evidence of which is the good side decision and the evil side decision, like for example an outline, a blue outline around the good side decision and a red outline around the evil side decision. No, here it's relative to the context, and like that I made a lot of choices in which I wanted to do the exact opposite. For example, the dragon cult that we did back in Seraphim Island, I wanted to help the natives to fight the cult, the dragon cult, and I ended up having to fight them in the Hammerlock fight. It's about to be published over at YouTube, I believe. There you can see that I wanted to choose, I wanted to help them by choosing accept, and I actually had to choose decline, or the other way around. I think I chose decline, and I wanted to do accept, to accept and help them, the good side portion of it. So in that sense, the accuracy of the moral system, of the moral choice system, would be the third flaw that I could encounter, but they are all minor flaws, without a doubt. The fact it's better than not implementing a moral system. Does Diablo 3 have a moral system, people? Does World of Warcraft have a moral system in which you can choose different branches of the story and you get different quests? No, not at all. And in most modern RPGs it's the same case. You cannot do that. You don't have a moral system implemented to it. The moral system also extends to side quests, so it's absolutely amazing. So pretty much you will get the best from both worlds. So in that sense, the level design, it's absolute perfection. I need to be fair, even if I find that flaw of the accuracy in the visual description of the moral choice system of the game, it's minuscule in comparison to the amount of quality that you are getting. You are getting 4 degrees of difficulty in World of Warcraft, something similar to that. Hellgate London only has 2 difficulties, and it's linear. Diablo 3 has several difficulties, but it's extremely linear. And if we think about it, the only games that implement this would be things like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, The Witcher 3, different with New Game Plus, with 2 difficulties, the same with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild with Elite Mode. 2 difficulties, generally it's 2 playthroughs, and the games are much more modern. Pay attention to the dates, people. I'm talking about games, I'm comparing this into games from 2015, from 2017, from 2020, 2022, things like that. games much more modern than this one. That's why I include the innovation category in the end. Much more modern. Here you have 4 difficulties with a massive map that is potentially bigger than in all of those games, or at least the same. So I almost forgot about that element. So I wanted to highlight it as the perfect reason as to why the level design system is objectively superior. It's not a matter of my mental perception, because it brings the best elements from different genres and combines them together. Imagine if we could have The Witcher 3 with 5 difficulties, or Skyrim with 5 difficulties, 5 different difficulties, or The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, adding that randomized. Borderlands is only 2 playthroughs. The first one and the second one. 2 playthroughs. This is 4. And the extension of the terrain is potentially bigger. So, amazing. In terms of how this affects the difficulty curve of the game, it will be absolutely massive. It will take you a lot of days to understand this game, the stat system, and this massive overworld at all. So the level design is also the 4th crowning achievement of this game, without a doubt. As I've said, I mentioned only 1 minuscule flaw for each category so far. 1 for the gameplay, 1 for the technical, and 1 for the level design. But absolutely massive. Enemy variety is massive. The mechanics, the perfect relationship in which between gameplay mechanics and the elemental system, how it influences enemy variety, because all enemies will be different, because they will have different elemental resistances and attack choices. Absolutely amazing. The level design, it's absolutely amazing. Just take a look at the map and you'll realize. Then you have the underground layer, which is as well the same, but you get the point right now. I could spend many more hours talking about this, but it's not the point. Perfect level design as well, because of the logical reasons that I just mentioned. Pretty much, I've never seen a game like this. And the flaws certainly are totally crushed by the virtues here. 4th category of the analysis, the Grandeur. Let's define it, because this is probably the most this is a special category that not a lot of people include. The Grandeur is the impact of the ambience and cohesion on the player, what we usually say call the story, but it's more complex than that. Talking about the main story, let's begin with that. It's not just the main story. Talking about the story, the most evident aspect of the Grandeur category of the analysis, the story will be different if you play the evil side quest or the good side quest. And it will have branches. The game has a lot of branches, unless you play the modded version that I played with all of the quests. And I also forgot to mention that the game has 2 expansions in terms of the level design that we are going to play after the analysis next week. The Ice and Blood expansions. Be sure to get them. It has a Christmas event as well. The only thing that this game's level design requires is dailies, and there we would have absolute perfection. Dailies. He's lacking dailies, kind of like making the server, the internal server, offline server of the game, create dailies also, and there it would be completely infinite. But it's close to infinity. It's much more efficient to have 4 difficulties in this massive world than dailies, because it also deals with repetitiveness in a pretty subtle way. Let's get to the Grandeur category, people. The main storyline of the game, it will be different if you choose the good side or the evil side. It has a lot of plot twists, and as I've said, they are voiced. The quality of the writing, it's incredibly high when compared to the taking into account the extension, the massive extension of the terrain and the duration of the game. It's true that it's not the best story ever that you will be surprised about. There are no cutscenes, for example, following the tradition of more MMORPG-oriented stories like World of Warcraft. In that sense, there you can see the huge influence of the MMORPG genre on this game. It's much more similar to the what I have been mentioning, the side quests of World of Warcraft than a much more linear story like Diablo. But the developers created a story, is quite good. It has a few plot twists. It's directly tied to the world bosses that you'll fight. It has two stories, good side and evil side stories, and it's interesting how the good side story is also related to the evil side story. Not going into many spoilers, but anyways, the story is absolutely secondary in this game. It's absolutely secondary. It's definitely a game in which you enjoy the journey more than the focus on the story. Don't expect something like, I don't know, heavily story-focused games like Uncharted, generally the ones that Sony does. Uncharted, The Last of Us, those that they are copies from movies. Don't think it's pretty much Indiana Jones. And there's another one, The Highway, I think that The Last of Us is based on. Pretty much, this game understands the perfect division between the film industry and the gaming industry, and the story takes a secondary place. However, it is cohesive, it's well designed. It will vary according to the class. Some classes can only do the good side, others the evil side. You can do both of them if you mod the game like we did, and you'll see all characters. Pretty much amazing. They are somehow intertwined. The stories, they are somehow intertwined. They are related. It's as if one story is it happens after the other one, so they are linked in a sense, which is a pretty good resource that not a lot of games do. For example, imagine if in World of Warcraft there was an order of stories. That, you know, which game implemented? The only other one I've seen is precisely Star Wars: The Old Republic. In Star Wars: The Old Republic, it's like the Jedi Knight story. I played them all, so I know it. The Jedi Knight story, it's kind of like Knights of the Old Republic 3. And for example, the Juggernaut story or the Sith Inquisitor story, it's Knights of the Old Republic 4 and 5 and etc, etc. That's why I say that Star Wars: The Old Republic is the best game of all time, because it's 8 games in one. And this game, it would be 2 in 1 in that very same sense, because one story, then in the same universe, the other one happens later in the same game. It's a concept that is not explored enough nowadays, and I loved to stumble upon it here. The rest, not only the story. That's why I always say that the grandeur category of the analysis is often overlooked and important. I mentioned this, I highlighted this, that this game has one of the best, meticulously, painstakingly designed sound systems of all time. Why? Because the amount of sounds that you will listen to in this game is amazing. And you will see this in a moment. When you pay attention, when you are playing the game, pay attention to what you are listening to. When you, in the swamp region, you can see this. When you enter a hut, a lizard man hut, for example, and in that region it's constantly raining because of the realistic weather conditions that I mentioned previously. See how they are all linked, all of the elements. The sound inside of the hut was recorded simulating the same 3D positional situation. It's kind of like listened to from the interior of the hut. You can listen to the rain falling, but outside of the hut. There's a sense of 3D positioning that is extremely well done. Not only that, the amount of footstep sound samples that you will find in this game, if you pay close attention, something that reviewers generally sadly don't pay attention to, it's different. The footstep samples, sound sample that you will listen to when walking on cement will be different when compared to the one walking on ground, metal, etc, 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 caves, etc. If you pay close attention, you will see the magnificence of the variety in sound samples of your footsteps, of the player's footsteps. And it's absolutely amazing, because in a lot of modern games, pay attention. Now I'll make you be addicted to pay attention to footstep sound samples. Generally they only incorporate to ground or dirt and pretty much metal or cement or whatever, or brick or whatever, or or wood. In this game also has wood. For example, some houses are made of wood inside of this game, and you can listen to the wood sound sample. You'll be surprised how many modern games don't incorporate that. The other aspect of the soundtrack, of course, the other aspect of the sound of the game is the soundtrack. Not only the physical sounds of the ambience, but also the soundtrack. The soundtrack is the one thing that could have been a bit more varied, but if we take into account, it could have been more varied. But if we take it, because it always uses the same combat music, in that sense, that would be a flaw in terms of the soundtrack design, not the ambience sound design, but the soundtrack design of the music, pretty much. However, let me highlight, in case you don't know, that the soundtrack of this game was performed by a real band. It was developed by a real band that the name that I got some copyrights when uploading the bots over at YouTube. That a band, Blind Guardian, from Germany. That the soundtrack is courtesy from them, the main theme of the game. And I'll give you this detail so you can see the labor of love that they did. Only when you finish the Blind Guardian quest that we did at the beginning. You have all of this documented in the early game section of my gameplay. At the beginning, we explored it with Scarlet Dragoon every day, pretty much. Huge shout out to you, Scarlet Dragoon, if you're then watching the analysis. Pretty much, Blind Guardian designed a main theme music for his main track for this game, and you only unlock it as part of the main menu of the game once you finish the Blind Guardian side quest, after you finish the first area of the game, and you have to specifically follow that quest line. A lot of players will play the game missing out the fact that they can change the soundtrack of the main menu of the game with a real song by a real band, in a real that was courtesy from of them to create it for exclusively for this game. There's also a short concert trailer, when you finish the mission and etc. And those details are amazing, showcasing that the developers of the game had made a labor of love when taking into account the soundtrack quality of this game. As I said, it's not every day that game developers incorporate real bands to create their soundtrack. As a quick reference, for example, there was a game from the third generation that incorporated this. From the seventh generation that incorporated this, but I can't remember the name. Jack Black starred in it, for example, and that game, for example, is a perfect example of that. It's from the seventh generation. Then I'll check it out. But well, it's not every day that we stumble upon this. So even if there isn't, that I would have thought about a higher degree of variety in terms of the soundtrack. For example, Diablo 3 has pretty good variety. I think World of Warcraft has pretty good ambience sounds, but not combat music in that sense. The variety could have been better in terms of the combat music. For example, Baldur's Gate does the same with the main combat theme. It's pretty amazing, but well, it's pretty much average, a bit above average, because of the fact that it's a real band doing it, and with a lot of quality, with all of the quality that it's involved within that process, pretty much. So a high degree of sound quality, but not with the variety in terms of soundtracks that I would have hoped. But that's a common mistake among all MMORPGs and isometric action RPGs. Just as another flaw that I wanted to highlight, but as I said, they're quite small, minuscule. Another aspect, the storyline of the rest of the quests, and precisely the topic that I talked about in the previous section, that is related to the influence of the level design. Pretty much side quests in this game are perfectly designed because of that cohesion. As I've said, it requires an incredible amount of personal culture by the developers to incorporate cohesive characters that that act according to their personalities, to their medieval cultural personalities, combined with a medieval fantasy setting at the same time. It takes an insane amount of talent, but not only that, this game has a lot of let's focus on the graveyards, the cemeteries of this game. They are full of real philosophical phrases by real philosophers. So the developers of this game also knew about that. So I personally, as you can imagine, I feel that the game was created by people with a high degree of general culture. They have real phrases from Aristotle, from Immanuel Kant, for example. They also have phrases from leaders, like for example Napoleon, and those things from historical figures. The degree of culture of this game, it's the highest I've ever seen, without a doubt. Without a doubt, it's a perfect marriage between real life culture, sadly, in a subtle way, injected within a fantasy medieval setting of the game. It's absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. So in the cemeteries you can see this, so I highly recommend you check out the cemeteries. They also have the beta testers cemetery. Once again, we say hello to Scarlet Dragoon that he was a beta tester of the game, precisely. So in a lot of graveyards of the game, you will find all of these amazing references that in a lot of modern games you won't find, not because the developers didn't want to do that, they didn't want to include them, but due to the fact that the amount of general culture required, the degree of education required in real life to incorporate those elements into your game is extremely high. And once again, that is influenced by the fact that the developers of the game try to make a replica precisely of Europe with the medieval fantasy settings on top of it. In terms of the medieval fantasy settings, I've already said that enemy variety, it's amazing, and artistically we are talking about a game that it's an absolute love letter to Dungeons and Dragons fans. So the medieval fantasy setting with realistic European culture is there, but also the medieval the fantasy part of it is absolutely incredible, from the designs of the dragons, from the ghosts, from how they perfectly depict. It's like it's as if, just like with the development of Morrowind, this also happened with the development of Morrowind. Few people know that the development of Morrowind is actually the Elder Scrolls 3. It's the own Dungeons and Dragons version of the developers over at Bethesda from back in the day. They used to play with the original world map that was then Morrowind, and in the case of this game I can pretty much see the same pattern of excellence, of absolute excellence in terms of the psychological impact of the cohesion of the world map that they created on the player. As I said, characters act according to their personality, both in a cultural medieval setting, which is the big flaw that Larian Studios has. For example, you can see that it's injected, it's kind of like as if a person from the present, from 2024, is injected in a medieval fantasy setting. Here we can see cohesion 100%, that characters act according to their personalities, from the pub, from the taverns, from the medieval taverns, and everything, and how they interact with each other. Even the most remote NPC of this massive map acts perfectly according to a medieval personality within a fantasy setting. Perfectly. The concept of the energy, we cannot forget it, the main premise of the game, pretty well done. It has a lot of Star Wars references with the lightsabers and everything, so it's not just a high philosophical degree of culture that the developers had. They also had a high degree of culture in terms of movies and pretty much everything. And that is extremely, trust me, that's extremely difficult to find, not only nowadays, but even back then. So we have a perfect marriage of fantasy settings and cohesive, realistic medieval a cohesive, realistic medieval setting. Perfectly executed. Perfectly executed. We are talking about the level of cohesion you would find in titans of the genre like Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale, for example. And as I've said, all of that realism, that geographical and weather realism. That's because, as I said, the climate is also realistic. It's absolutely incredible. The extension of the terrain, incredible, and that all affects the cohesion in terms of the grandeur category of the analysis. We've already covered the main story, the quest objective variety, enemy variety, pretty much everything that the game had to offer. Due to the combination of all of these elements of what we have been already analyzing for 40 days, the end result, it's a degree of realism culturally combined with a perfect fantasy in terms of the Dungeons and Dragons inherited influence that the game has. So, with all of that, the end result is that the grandeur is also perfectly executed. The designs are amazing, the geography, as I said, it's absolutely amazing, the cohesion, etc., etc. Everything that we have been mentioning. Let's get to the next category of the analysis, the last category that I always include, because it's the most overlooked one in game reviews nowadays, which is the innovation. How much sacred to, and that's why first we do the genre classification of the game as an isometric offline MMORPG, how much Sacred 2 redefines the mechanics and everything else that I've been mentioning of the genre it belongs to. Let's first remember that the genre it belongs to, it's isometric offline MMORPG and not isometric action RPG. It's much more similar to World of Warcraft and Diablo, and precisely at this point I wanted to incorporate another element of the genre classification before we get into it, because I was waiting for this one. Not only is the extension of the map and the quest density similar to an MMORPG, but the pacing, the second element that I mentioned in the intro, let's dwell a bit deeper into it. There's the concept of casting time. This game also has the concept of pushback. It also has the concept of regeneration times. All elements, these are all elements that are inherently belong to the MMORPG genre instead of the isometric action RPG genre. Think about the average cooldown times of Diablo 3 or Diablo 2 and compare them to the cooldowns in World of Warcraft. In the main rotation of your character, not like the ultimate abilities. Think about them for a second, people, and you'll find out that in Diablo 3, cooldown times and isometric action RPG games in general, like Titan Quest, Torchlight, The Incredible Adventures of Van Helsing, Victor Brand, etc., etc., Shadows Awakening, Warhammer Inquisitor Martyr, pretty much. The other one, I always forget about this. Wolves and Lords of Mayhem and Warhammer Chaos Bane. Think about all of them. Think about the average cooldown times of your abilities in those games and compare them to the cooldown times in World of Warcraft, in Lineage 2, in MMORPG games in general. You'll find that there's a huge gap in terms of the temporal dissociation. The cooldowns are much longer in MMORPG games, even in the case of the main rotation of your character. Much longer, and they also incorporate the concept of pushback, a pretty abstract concept that we don't see mentioned a lot nowadays in terms of the tab targeting combat system of games, and the concept of casting time. For example, Havencast Rise of the Mage also incorporated casting time, but not pushback. Pushback, or also called alacrity rating in Star Wars: The Old Republic, as a posh naming convention. Pushback, it's the first you have the casting time, right? You have abilities in World of Warcraft that take some time to cast, or are channeled abilities that, for example, the fourth line in Star Wars: The Old Republic, or the arcane missiles in World of Warcraft, that they take 3 seconds. However, after that channeled ability ends, and there you can see it perfectly if you download any add-on, there's roughly 300 milliseconds, 300 extra milliseconds, or 200, depends on the game and the technology of the server of the MMORPG, and it's not because of that, because in tab targeting combat games, there's something called the pushback. The amount of time it takes the player, and those are those extra 300 milliseconds before the player can activate the next ability of his rotation. If you play I need to depict this in we'll depict this in World of Warcraft because I have an add-on that measures it. It's roughly 300 milliseconds or 200 milliseconds. In Star Wars: The Republic, you can manipulate it, which is the pushback. The amount of time the game imposes on the player after casting an ability, a channeled ability. Generally, you can see it in it. After the final tick of the channeled ability is spent, there's an extra 300 milliseconds before the animation of your next ability. It's pretty typical in MMORPG games. It also has to do with the connection with the server, but it's added on top of the delay of the server. Well, since they are a few milliseconds, people generally don't know about it. But Sacred 2, since it was originally thought as an MMORPG, and here you have clear evidence of this, and not an isometric action RPG, it takes into account the concept of casting time. It takes some milliseconds between pressing a button and performing the ability, and the time it takes for the animation to travel and impact on the mob. By the way, it also has floating damage numbers. That's always an extra for the game. But you can see it there. See how much time it takes between pressing a button and when the animation goes to a fireball or whatever, and it impacts on the mob, and the floating damage number is executed. You'll see that there's a delay, and that is all influenced by casting times and pushback. I know these are extremely abstract concepts, but you will see that they define that originally blurred line between the isometric action RPG genre, Diablo, Titan Quest, Torchlight, and the MMORPG genre. As I've said, quest density also plays a big role. Diablo 3 and 2 don't have an insane amount of side quests like this game, but the casting times and the overall pace of the combat, that influences the overall pace of the combat, that pushback or alacrity rating that I'm mentioning, and the casting times in Havencast Rise of the Mage, in World of Warcraft, in MMORPGs in general, and also in Sacred 2, the pace of the combat is much lower when compared to Diablo. Why? Because of all of these concepts that generally people don't even know they exist and don't pay attention to, and they define the pace of the combat. See how important it is. It's not the same having the hack and slash influence of Diablo than the more slow-paced influence of World of Warcraft. See how different it is. And with all of that, we can perfectly define that this is an MMORPG and not an isometric action RPG. So, Sacred 2, how does it redefine each of the genres that I mentioned at the beginning? Let's begin with the most basic elements. Straight up, the abstract complexity of the elemental system with a defensive gameplay system that you won't find in any game ever. Borderlands only uses it offensively. World of Warcraft only has a one-dimensional system. Pretty much the abstract complexity of the elemental system alone, because of how much it enhances the quality of the abstract mental model required for the player to break that psychological barrier erected to be efficient in combat, and thus having a positive economic income and everything, and creating that domino effect in terms of the learning curve of the game. Only because of that, only because it's a unique system that I haven't seen, and I have played a lot of games, trust me. Only because of that, of the innovation in terms of the relationship with the gameplay mechanics. Only because of that, the game, it redefines the genre. It's just that it's not attributed enough. But as I've said at the beginning, think about Path of Exile 2, think about Ark, for example. Ark, it's a Korean MMO isometric action isometric MMORPG. Think about Diablo 4, the most modern exponents, the most modern paradigms of the MMO isometric, the isometric MMORPG genre, the MMORPG genre, with the subcategory being the isometric camera, instead of over the shoulder or behind the player or centered behind the player. Think about the most modern ones, and you'll see that they follow the example of Sacred 2, not of Diablo 3. They may follow the pace in terms of the combat of Diablo 3. True, in terms of the pace of the combat in those games, it's much more hack and slashy, and in that sense Diablo 3 popularized that style. But in terms of precisely in terms of the overall development philosophy of the level design, of the elemental system that you would find in Borderlands, for example, or everything, or pretty much any of those modern games, you will see they follow the design of Sacred 2. It's just that the game is so underrated, so unknown, like most cases that we treat here on the channel. By the way, I also have a pretty good case for next week. Or we can do the Ultimate PS Vita showcase. But just like Advent Rising that I mentioned long ago, which is the predecessor of Mass Effect, you have the analysis on the YouTube channel, or even Cast Rise of the Mage, these are cases that redefine the genre in such a subtle way and so incredible that it's difficult to replicate. But you will see a lot of influences in modern games. Borderlands, the elemental system, for example, directly. But the fact that in this game it's used defensively, it has never been replicated. So I'm generally able to establish a direct comparison with more modern games, but no modern game uses an elemental system defensively, effectively eliminating 50% of the gameplay mechanics. So I have no point of comparison. It's a unique system that so far, maybe correct me if I'm wrong as a comment over at the YouTube board, there's no game that uses an elemental damage system defensively. Borderlands only uses it offensively, and World of Warcraft doesn't even have it implemented. So if there are already few examples of games with a 5-pronged, in this case with 5 elemental types of damage, it's even much more uncommon to find a game which uses it defensively, and on top of that, in which there's a dissociation in the loot system of the game, which is randomly generated, I might add, in which basic attacks are dissociated from combat abilities in how they influence the elemental system of the game. As I've said at the beginning, your main weapon will affect the elemental system of your basic attacks, and your globes or other pieces of equipment or modify the elemental system of your abilities. That dissociation in terms of the loot system that is also used defensively and in an active way, because you have to constantly switch between relics, so it's not brain dead as well, the defense system of the game. It's so unique that I don't have a comparison this time, and that's pretty weird. It's the first time. I don't have a comparison. No other game works like this. No other game works like this, as far as I can tell. Feel free to prove me wrong, people, if you're watching this as a YouTube pod in the future. But no game works like this. The abstract complexity implemented here, it's on a level that is absolutely it's in an unprecedented level, absolutely unprecedented. I don't have any record of this abstract complexity in terms of gameplay mechanics. In terms of the level design, generally you don't get 4 types of difficulty combined with a massive open world. I won't repeat myself. It's an absolute unique combination as well. In terms of the story and the soundtrack, could have been better, but they do have their plot twists, and just because of the cohesion of the characters, is something that we don't see nowadays as well, due to either DEI policies or political influence or whatever, or pretty much the fact that developers don't have that high amount of culture to perfectly replicate a realistic Europe. A realistic Europe in their games with fantasy elements. Because of all of that, I haven't stumbled upon that in a lot of other cases. It could be Baldur's Gate as a direct comparison. So it's sad, as I've said, I began this analysis today saying that this was a tragic case, and precisely the innovation category of the analysis is the main reason, besides all of the good ideas that we've been exploring, because this game redefines a lot of concepts which modernly could be implemented to enhance a lot of modern games, and this game is completely ignored. So it's a tragedy, it's an absolute tragedy, especially due to the innovation category of the analysis. It's an absolute tragedy that certainly that it doesn't get the praise it definitely deserves as a consequence of this. It redefines a lot of aspects that you will fast travel, calling your mount directly, many more elements that you won't stumble upon in a lot of cases. The fact that when you ride a mount, you get different stats, it's another thing. The fact that you, for example, that will increase your defense, your evasion chance, and those things. So the fact that your mount affects your stats, it's another great idea. The fact that you can call your mount, the fact that you can fast travel, they are all things that, well, for example, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time fixed fast travel. These are all things that we usually don't see, that we didn't see back in the day. For example, in Baldur's Gate, you back in the day you couldn't do that. In the case of World of Warcraft, your mount wouldn't affect your stats, etc, 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 etc. Many more things. So it redefines a lot of mechanics of the genre. Sadly, this game is ignored. It's an absolute tragedy that this game is ignored nowadays. What I would definitely recommend you to do is to play this game. It's a must play. After 40 days of gameplay, this game, it's a must play without a doubt. It is the closest, it's one of the epitomes of being the closest system to objective metaphysical perfection that I've seen in a lot of game reviews that I've done. So let's get into the ending, people. The final qualification. I bet you could see it coming, in spite of the 3 flaws that I have mentioned. The lack of accuracy of the targeting system for area of effect attacks, that you cannot target the ground. The soundtrack that I said, the variety in combat soundtrack variety, and I mentioned one more that now I can remember. It's been almost 4 hours of analysis. Besides those 3 small flaws, besides those, and the crashes and the technical crashes, the fact that the game does crash. In spite of all of those things, they are extremely minuscule, and even with the crashes taken into account, the game deserves a perfect S+ qualification. Probably absolutely the highest possible, just like Avengas Rise of the Mage, just like Advent Rising for their respective genres. Another influence that it has is that in the case of the isometric action RPG genre, as I mentioned, a lot of games incorporate group content elements that, for example, you don't find in Diablo 3 with the degree of integration that you find in this game. Another thing is that, for example, the Elder Scrolls Online incorporates a choice system pretty similar to this one, with that huge gray area in which it's a moral system in which there's no right and wrong consequences, a much more relativized system. So pretty much it influenced a lot of games from different genres, and I consider elements in those games as well. Because of all of this, a perfect qualification, even with the crashes, without a doubt. I highly recommend you play this game, mitigate the crashes as much as you can, and I would tell you that this is a must-play. Top 10 games of all time, quite probably top 10 games of all time, which is something that I didn't mention for Advent Rising, for example, or other isometric action RPGs that we've analyzed on the channel or RTS. This is a top 10 easily. Top 10 games of all time, and as I always show you in my desktop, on my desktop, I have played a lot of games. It's a top 10 easily, just because of the expanse of the massive overworld combined with the high degree of detail. So perfect qualification. If you want me to be from 1 to 10, it's a 10. No discussion about it at all. It's absolutely in terms of defining the objective quality of this game. You could criticize one or two things, but it's an absolute 10, an absolute S qualification, perfect S plus S qualification, absolutely perfect. If you want me to be extremely strict and accurate, it would be 99.999999999% because of the crash. If there would be a remaster without the crash, that would be the difference between that 99.99999% and perfection. But considering that, for example, Ambience also had this problem, and a lot of games from this period of time, Diablo 3 also had that, it was much more a temporal flaw of that period of time in which this game was released. And if we take into account that it's a direct consequence of being extra ambitious by the developers of trying to have the best bleeding edge tech and physics system ever in their game, if we take into account that, as I've said, it's a philosophy of prioritizing perfection and quality above all else, if we take into account that it's a sacrifice that the developers did, and that if we pay attention to it, it's a noble mindset, if we take all of that into account, this game is the very definition of perfection. Objectively, metaphysically, objectively, is the very definition of perfection in terms of the MMORPG genre, isometric action MMORPG genre in this case, because of the camera. And as I've said, you won't find a lot of games like this one, so it's unique. And trust me, I highly recommend it. Fix the crashes, it's well worth it. Hopefully we have a remaster eventually, but if we don't, even with the crashes, even with everything that I have mentioned, with all of the flaws, it's a perfect qualification. A game can have flaws and still be objectively perfect, because it's the perfect epitome, the perfect representation objectively of everything that the developers of the game set out to do initially in a perfect way, even compared to the titans of the genre with World of Warcraft and everything. So kudos to the developers over at Ascaron, officially, after playing these masters of the genre. I would say that the first one is a must play as well, if it's the same as this game. They were absolute masters of the genre. Ascaron, they're still developing games, fortunately, under the banner of Deep Silver, if I'm not mistaken, according to the history of the genre that we explored in the first sections of our 40-day review. And pretty much we have witnessed in these 40 days perfection personified in terms of the MMORPG genre, isometric action RPG genre, modern RPG, and classic RPG genre. This game is the epitome of perfectly combining. It's at the pinnacle of the mountain of RPG games that you'll stumble upon in your life, people. I highly recommend it. A unique elemental system with the abstract complexity, with an unprecedented abstract complexity that you won't find in any other game ever, because games don't use elemental systems defensively pretty much. So even with the crashes, even with the targeting system flaws that I mentioned, with the inaccuracies, even with the lack of soundtrack variety, of the lack of combat soundtrack variety, even with those flaws, the game is a 10 out of 10, no discussion about it. It's a plus S, perfect example of everything that is correct in all of those 4 genres that I have been constantly mentioning. The epitome, the absolute pinnacle of those 4 genres combined, with a lot of ideas that you simply won't find anywhere else.